Alright, almost done. Just gotta post the video. This was probably not a good subject to spend months on. I'm not sure who cares about this Kingsfield thing anyway. Ah well, at least I didn't do something stupid like make a tech war video. Whatever, I guess we'll see. Okay, I guess people still care about Kingsfield. That, or the YouTube algorithm really likes showing Kingsfield videos to sleeping people. Maybe a little bit of both. Slow, cryptic, difficult. In some ways, it's a shock that Kingsfield and its sister series Shadow Tower weren't forgotten. They very well may have been, if not for the fact that Fromsoft went on to make some of the most beloved and genre-redefining games of their respective generations, sparking a widespread curiosity towards that early output. As it turns out, the lo-fi dungeon crawling of Kingsfield and Shadow Tower seem to resonate more now than they did in their own day. Why is that exactly? What is it about these games that manages to ignite our imaginations so many years later? I think more than anything, it's the mood. Perhaps contrary to expectation, the unique character of these games is only enhanced by the rudimentary graphics and bare-bones sound. There's a bleakness and austerity present in these game worlds that drives our curiosity, a desire to see what lost cities can still be found beneath the surface and what monstrosities may still inhabit them. It's skeletons. Skeletons inhabit them. Turns out my timing when making that Kingsfield video was pretty good, as plenty of developers were cooking up their own games inspired by the series, many of which have seen a release since then. In the age of the Souls-like, the Kings-like takes a step back in time, stripping the formula down to its bare essentials and taking place in first person. The focus here is on atmosphere, exploration, immersion, and deliberately paced dungeon crawling that rewards curiosity and thoroughness. When asked for the definition of a Kingsfield-inspired game during the 1964 Kingsfield hearings, a brave Supreme Court justice simply replied, "I know it when I see it." That man's name? Archimedes of Syracuse. New York, not Greece. Some people have a problem with subgenre titles that immediately draw comparisons to specific games, feeling that it cheapens the games with the label. Not for nothing, I can understand where people are coming from. We don't call slasher movies Halloween-likes or Western movies The Great Train Robbery-likes. But games are the sum of, among many other things, specific mechanics, and this makes them a different beast than any other medium. The phrase Kings-like isn't meant to be reductive or imply that these games are rote copies of From's work, not in the least. It's like saying JRPG or WRPG. The geographic location isn't really the important part. Saying, "This game is a JRPG," doesn't paint the whole picture, but it's a useful way of immediately communicating a certain design aesthetic. It also doesn't put you in a situation where I have to spend 15 minutes describing turn-based combat, character-driven stories, predefined protagonists, linear plot progression, and a dozen other boring things that'll put us all to sleep. Until we come up with another word for games with mechanics pioneered by Souls games like Grunkry-Prux, Souls-like is going to be the most appropriate term. For Kingsfield, I'm partial to Kings-like, because Kingsfield-like is just kind of an unwieldy phrase, and field-like is best reserved as a description for the rectangular playing surface used in the sport of football. It's looking pretty field-like out there. I don't have hard criteria to qualify a game as a Kings-like, nor are any of the games featured in this video solely inspired by Kingsfield, but there is a sort of Voight-Kampff test that I abide by. Aside from the points I mentioned already, an important factor is an acknowledgement of Kingsfield and/or Shadow Tower's influence, either explicitly, say from the developer in an interview or a product description on Steam, otherwise implicitly through winks and nudges in-game, the inclusion of a Moonlight Sword analog for instance. With that in mind, let's explore a gallery of games, some from back in the day, and many modern projects that bear the torch of old Fromsoft, exhibitions of creativity from smaller developers who recognize a hunger for the unique, dreamlike atmosphere of Kingsfield. Let's go ahead and kick things off with a period-appropriate Kings-like made by Fromsoft themselves. I'm talking, of course, about Eternal Ring. Well, maybe it's not of course. I wouldn't blame you if you weren't familiar with Eternal Ring. It's certainly not unknown, but it's kind of flown under the radar compared to Kingsfield or even Shadow Tower in recent years. This game has the honor of being one of two PlayStation 2 launch titles developed by Fromsoft themselves, the other being EverGrace, a game notable for sounding like this.
What you listening to, son?
I don't think you like it.
Well, why not? I like this new generation of music. Mother of God, it's fake.
From the company's first release with Kingsfield back in 1994 to the turn of the millennium, Fromsoft had steadily released a catalog of positively received games. Sequels to Kingsfield, Armored Core, Echo Knight, Shadow Tower, From's games typically sold well, not great, but well, and more relevantly, many have gone down as beloved cult classics. Now, with the PS2 on the horizon, company founder Naotoshi Jin quickly decided to embrace the new hardware, going all in on Sony's newest console. Amidst the exaggerated fervor surrounding the system's emotion engine CPU and the realistic graphics and AI that would hypothetically come as a result, Jin's outlook on the PS2 was refreshingly pragmatic. Not only did he not buy into the hype, but he had some rather prescient concerns regarding the problems developers would one day face with increased graphical fidelity. For example, in RPGs, let's say a developer tries to add more variety to the graphics used to represent treasure chests. That may increase the realism, but it also makes it harder for players to recognize what's a treasure chest. Don't you worry your pretty little head, Mr. Jin. We've solved that problem, with buckets upon glorious buckets of yellow paint. Most of the time, realism and emotional expressiveness are completely unrelated. I do want to make games on the new PlayStation that couldn't be done before, but we're talking things like having more enemies on screen or larger maps. Very simple stuff. We should all be talking about how to make the entire game industry more interesting, but I feel like the focus is always on something else. Well, you gotta hand it to From, they certainly helped make the industry more interesting. Fromsoft was one of few Sony-affiliated developers that managed to survive in the long term. From the origin of the PlayStation, where they struggled to compete with Nintendo, all the way to the launch of the PS2, which would go on to outsell Nintendo by orders of magnitude. From was positioned to be a champion of the PS2, and so they began firing out software at unprecedented rates. Starting in 1999, From became one of the most prolific third-party game studios in Japan. This marked the beginning of a very weird time in the company's history. Gone were the days of one game per year. Now they were releasing 5, 7, 10 games annually, many of which were pretty bad. However, through established fan bases in series like Armored Core, deals made with publishers like Sega, and just sheer volume of games, From managed to stay profitable during this time. It's this period of From's history, between its humble beginnings on the PS1 and the breakout success that would come from Demon's Souls' positive reception in 2009. This period is what characterized the company's identity for a long time. It's hard to imagine this knowing From as we do, a prestigious studio whose games sell in the tens of millions, set design trends in the industry, and pick up awards more effortlessly than Horaloo picks up a Tarnished. Release me! Not like this! But in the early to mid-2000s, Fromsoft was sort of the butt of jokes. They were like the video game equivalent of Blumhouse Productions, throwing resources at project after project, hoping at least one errant dart might hit its bullseye. What we're left with from this period is a multitude of low-budget games with subpar production values, weird controls, and poor localizations. This often makes them entertaining, at least, even if not as intended. At the front of this pack, we've got EverGrace and Eternal Ring, the latter of which, as I've mentioned, we'll be talking about today. Eternal Ring is a very Kingsfield-adjacent game. Supposedly, it began its production under the working title Kingsfield Gaiden, although I can't find a primary source for that. But I'm a YouTuber. I'm revered. You should just accept what I'm telling you uncritically. Even across Eternal Ring's middling contemporary reviews, comparisons were inevitable, such as in the case of IGN's subheading calling it a Kingsfield Redux. But Kingsfield was not well appreciated in its day, and hindsight has been rather kind to that series. Is it possible we've got Eternal Ring all wrong, that it deserved better than its poor reviews and subpar sales? There's only one way to find out.
That night, Kane Morgan was lost in the dreams of his childhood.
The game begins with a voiceover intro giving us some background into this world. Sometime in the recent past, a group of knights from a country called Hyngaria were sent to a mysterious island. While Hyngaria is nominally ruled by a king, a group of elders actually pulled the political strings, leaving King Ian in the dark over this expedition. Hearing tales of a powerful artifact called the Eternal Ring on the island, a loyalist to the king named Gillian decides to send his son, Kane, to the island to find out what happened, and maybe, just maybe, find the Eternal Ring. Ian, Kane, and Gillian are all relatively normal names. I miss the classic Fromsoft that would name the characters things like Glaus Pringert or Flint Spruel, but I'm willing to abide here.
If you're gonna deliver that ladder, lot better off doing it before nightfall.
Okay, thank you, Andrew Dice Clay. I gotta tie my boat up at the Hickory Dickory Dock. Oh! The first thing I notice about Eternal Ring is that the game does not have analog controls. This, despite being one of the only games I've ever played that says, hey, don't worry, big guy, this game has analog controls right in the pause menu. I guess technically on some level it does have analog controls because it uses the PS2's pressure-sensitive buttons to dictate how fast you turn or move, which is a very interesting decision. Commendable attempt to utilize new hardware, but doesn't really benefit the game. Otherwise, we have a customarily awkward Kingsfield-like set of controls, turning and moving forward with the D-pad, strafing with the shoulder buttons, looking up and down with the other shoulder buttons, and attacking using the triangle button. It's unintuitive in a distinctly Fromsoft way. The good news is that if you're emulating the game, either officially through the PSN release or through other means, you can use the analog sticks, which makes it a bit better. Because of the pressure-sensitive buttons, you do have to alter some dead zones or else play the game trapped in interpretive dance mode. The Kingsfield-ness is pretty evident from the moment you start. It's a first-person dungeon crawler. You encounter enemies, you swing your sword, and back away, circle strafe, or otherwise find ways to bide time until you can swoop back in and hit the enemy. You do this until an enemy is dead, you collect their schmongle, and then you move forward. You can also just turn around and fucking die instantly, which is as Kingsfield-like as all get out. Things start feeling a little different by the time you leave the introductory cave area and arrive at the Investigation Core camp. It's kind of a bucolic little Dragon Questy village where you can press X to talk, where you can stand in front of NPCs that don't talk to you.
Please say hello to me. Please say hello to me.
You report to the expedition leader who recognizes you as a messenger for the king.
Okay, let me take your sword. I'll put it in safekeeping as part of the team's inventory.
I'm still trying to figure this out. So for some reason he takes your sword from you and then tells you to go get a different sword from the warehouse manager. Okay, whatever.
Give you a sword?
Yeah, you took mine, so that would be great.
The king wants you to retrieve the eternal power? Hey, how are you doing?
Wow, we buried the hatchet quickly there. So they take your very weak short sword and then give you a knife, which is the same thing but even worse? Why? The good news is that you can buy your sword back. You'll get what's coming to you, you bastard. This whole village section gives the game a much stronger JRPG flavor than any of the Kingsfields, and it makes sense when you consider From's output at the time. They were trying to make something a little less mature and grim. This is a game with broader appeal, something that would serve as a more inviting launch title. They even put a healing waifu in the game to get people all steamed up. Wow, Harawat Bababiat. You're told that the team is investigating the nearby water shrine and you're asked to help explore further.
We have no idea what it's like inside.
Oh, well then you guys are doing a pretty shitty job of investigating it. I don't really understand the story at this point. You play as Kane Morgan, a loyalist who's supposed to investigate the secret research team. Then the research team manager is like, hey, welcome here, we've been expecting you. Also, I can't believe you're here, the captain's gonna be pissed. I'm gonna take your sword now for no reason. We've been hard at work investigating the nearby water shrine, which we've never seen before. Please venture into the shrine to find something. We don't know what, but we're willing to die in order to find it. Well, not us, but you. Now you can say, listen pal, I ain't helping you or anybody, but you'll quickly come across a roadblock. You gotta respect a game that tells it like it is. Nothing worse than Blue Door, other than maybe Red Door. Why does the blue door get a period while the red door doesn't? Somebody needs to get to the bottom of it. The Water Shrine is the first real dungeon in Eternal Ring, and it's here where some of the differences between this game and the Kingsfield series become more apparent. First of all, the game is just faster paced. Look and movement are both much speedier, and you don't have a power or stamina bar to manage when swinging your weapon. You just swing when you can, with all smacks being created equal. This will make the game sound much easier, and it is, but there are some ways that Eternal Ring compensates for the increased mobility. The courtesy is extended to your enemies, which are by and large much more flexible than the early Fromsoft cannon fodder. They can run towards or away from you in irregular patterns, tripping you up and making their movement tough to predict. They can backstep away from your swings, they can trap you in place or hurl projectiles at you. None of this is going to be especially interesting if you've played later From Software games, but compared to, say, Kingsfield 3, there's a surprising variety of enemies and unique behaviors on display here. Bosses similarly have a decent set of moves, with attacks that utilize their environments in different ways. Obvious ones perhaps, but it still makes for more engaging melee combat than you might expect. It's not all roses. Eternal Ring has a major problem in its combat. Well, it has like 50, but this is one of them. Your character seemingly has no iframes after taking damage. If you're, say, ganged up on by 5 enemies, which is not an uncommon situation to be in, a single attack from each will completely melt your health. This becomes even more frustrating later in the game, when large groups of enemies fire projectiles at you from outside of your peripheral vision. It doesn't matter how much health you have, when that damage stacks as quickly as it does here, you're cooked. Sometimes enemies will just tickle your bottom with a feather and you couldn't be bothered. In fact, you might even be delighted, but other times they'll nuke you before you even know they're around. This inconsistent level of lethality in encounters makes the game frustrating. This is the benefit of Kingsfield's slowness. An enemy can get the drop on you, and that can mean disaster, but at least you have an opportunity to course correct, which makes things feel less cheap. Here it's just like, tough, no checkpoints, reload your save, bitch. It's not always a problem, but it is a problem, and one that could have been solved so easily. Just have the player blink with invincibility for half a second when they take damage and Bob's your uncle. As opposed to the slow, menacing, deliberate movements of the Kingsfield games, enemies in Eternal Ring have a quickness and bounciness to their movements that gives everything more of a kid-friendly veneer. You don't feel so much like you're contending with threats, but rather dealing with little mischief creatures. This is partially owed to the fact that the game runs at 60 frames per second, and respect to From for making that happen. Compare this to the 15 to 20 FPS of From's PS1 games, plus the quicker camera movement, and everything feels less weighty. This is because there's not much by way of acceleration or deceleration on animations. Everything abruptly starts and stops. Dark Cloud 1 was kind of the same way. I guess it's just like an early PS2 specialty. These quick movements give everything a sillier quality, which contributes to a less grim atmosphere overall. Well, at least in principle. After completing the water shrine and finding the key to Blue Door, you return to the village and find everybody dead. Well, not everybody. This cool-ass dude survived. This angel man, who looks to be the transformed captain of the expedition, appears to be the cause of the destruction.
The Eternal Ring is mine! Mine! Mine!
Alright, I get it. Hey, my sword! Everyone who's mean to me deserves bad things like this. After burying the villagers, Kain sets off to discover more about the Eternal Ring and seek vengeance for the destruction of the camp. Or something, I think. I don't know, I'm not a mind reader. From this moment onward, you gain access to a magical dais next to your save points, which is actually tied to the most unique aspect of Eternal Ring's design, that being the rings. As you move through the game, you'll collect different gems as well as, rarely, a magic ring. This ring represents a blank slate, with which you can craft an elemental ring that allows you to cast different spells in combat. In order to do this, you need to step on the dais and go to this little wiener's world. I cannot hear this theme music without thinking of Charles Cornell's rendition of Happy Birthday.
Happy birthday, dear Jimmy.
There are 6 elements and so 6 categories of gems that can drop. Fire, water, wind, earth, light, and darkness, with the latter 2 being much less common. These gems have potencies from level 1 to 5. When you visit the magic wiener, you can give him a blank magical ring and enchant it with up to 6 different gems. Some of these are really simple. If you enchant a ring with 14 levels of wind gems, you'll create a tornado ring, which shoots tornadoes. This can be 4 level 3 gems and a level 2 gem, or whatever, it doesn't really matter as long as it equals 14 and you're using 6 gems or less. There are many different types of rings as well as combinations. Using only water gems will create rings that heal the user, while mixing water gems with wind gems will create attack rings using the water element. There are many combinations and many rings that you can create, and this is pretty cool. Experimenting by mixing and matching gems to create rings is satisfying, and finding higher level gems means potentially higher level rings too. Going from fireballs to literal bombs or ice pellets to a blizzard that surrounds the player makes for a unique progression system. There is a degree of trial and error here, which is annoying. There aren't any hints or ring recipes, and you just kind of have to infer what will make a ring and what won't, which can result in wasted gems. But you're not really intended to make every single ring. You can, but you don't have to. It's pretty stupid that you still use up rings even if you don't successfully make a new one, but at least a save point is always nearby so you can reload if you screw up. Given how hard it is to find these rings in the wild, I'd say the game kinda owes you some save scumming anyway. On top of the active rings, there's also support rings which can boost your damage in a particular element, reveal invisible treasures, or increase the amount of experience you gain from enemies. There's a level system, but it's pretty rudimentary, bumping up your stats without any input from the player. For the most part, your strength increases will be a result of creating new rings. Enemies have elemental weaknesses and strengths, and time passes in-game, which affects how strong or weak a particular element is at the time. In addition, you can only have 5 active rings and 5 support rings equipped at a time, so it's something you have to pay attention to and deal with often. The rings are a unique hybrid of player progression items and in-game collectibles. It is sort of cozy to browse through your ring list, which gives you a description as well as a higher quality render of each ring that you can admire. It's kind of insane that they managed to populate this list with 100 unique rings and that each one has its own design. They all look pretty good. It may be a bit of a trite observation, but the concept of hunting down special rings which affect your character's build is something that would be deeply taken to heart by From's later games. Even the way the rings look is very Souls-like, and sure enough, one of Eternal Ring's 2D artists, Keiichiro Ogawa, would go on to work as both lead and UI artist in later Fromsoft projects such as Dark Souls 3. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some measurable carryover there. I just like poring over my rings. I'm beginning to understand the boomer instinct to have a china cabinet. It's nice to admire relics that serve absolutely no purpose and that your own family is not important enough to warrant the use of. The focus on elements is also kind of a neat twist. It's nothing new, but it's real important to be using the right damage at times. Enemies will often only recoil with damage to elements that they're weak against, which is a subtle but nice bit of feedback to help you determine what is or isn't working. The odd puzzle or environmental interaction will utilize ring elements too, stuff like burning hives to taunt a queen bee into fighting or using fire-based spells to light torches do come into play here and there. There are more than a few problems that crop up as a result of this ring-focused gameplay. Eternal Ring is specifically designed to be a simpler game. It's less of an RPG than Kingsfield, which isn't a particularly complex RPG to begin with. There's no armor or shields in this game at all, and there are only very few weapons, like 6 in total. Plus we've established 2 of them, the short sword and the knife, both of which suck. The most interesting weapon in the game is the Kaiser Knuckle, which has great offense but tanks your magic damage, and it's really only used for one fight. There's also the Eternal Sword, which looks pretty familiar. That's right, it's modeled after the Moonlight Sword from the From Software classic 3D dot game heroes. Anyway, the side effect of this limited RPG-ness is that the loot variety is pretty much null and void in Eternal Ring. Typically that wouldn't be the end of the world. I mean, loot variety in Ocarina of Time isn't great, but its dungeons are fantastic. Dungeons in Eternal Ring are not fantastic. Because Kingsfield's gameplay, which Eternal Ring is based on, is already so basic at its core, removing any of its components risks oversimplifying things and making the experience boring. Eternal Ring definitely suffers in this way. It introduces a more traditional form of storytelling as well as the ring crafting system, but it's still a dungeon crawler at heart. Most of your time here is spent walking around corridors, finding keys, opening doors, and fighting enemy after enemy. Part of what makes a dungeon crawler engaging is the player's belief that secrets and valuables could always be around the next corner. There's a reason why even the earliest tabletop role-playing games use imagery of intrepid adventurers stumbling over glistening hoards of treasure. It's because there's something innately exciting about the idea that in facing danger and venturing onward, we may discover untold riches that could change our lives forever, even if only our avatars. I've scarcely felt anything as exciting as finding a truly kick-ass weapon or piece of armor in Kingsfield. That moment you find some magical equipment, you realize the way you engage with the game will unexpectedly change, bringing about a new micro-era for your character. It's the promise of empowerment, it's a reward for exploration, and it's also variety in gameplay. That's why it's so critical for a dungeon crawler, a genre that, more than most, runs that risk of becoming monotonous, to boost your morale and give you reasons to keep fighting the good fight. Eternal Ring only promises more blank magical rings and more elemental gems, neither of which are particularly exciting after you've found your 1,000th of each. The most substantial items in the game are the active effect rings, which are cool, no doubt, but these aren't uncovered via exploration, only crafted in a controlled environment. Removing that spontaneity undermines a major incentive in dungeon crawling. As cool as the ring crafting system is in concept, I think rings would have been better served as treasure from enemies or chests. Even without the extrinsic incentive, good dungeons can ease the pain, but sadly, Eternal Ring doesn't have them. Kingsfield 4's Ancient City is a brilliantly interconnected dungeon, with layers upon layers of satisfying exploration to be had. Shadow Tower's Abyss is an anachronistic dreamscape where you can't go more than a few minutes without finding a kooky new piece of gear to mess around with. Eternal Rings dungeons are just hopelessly uninspired. There's nothing interesting about them aside from the odd enemy design which stands out, or the very odd usage of elemental rings in navigation. Even those few puzzles that made it into the game are so weak that it'd almost be better off without them. You'll find a locked door, so go down the only other path in the dungeon and push a switch to open it. Step on a platform and wait for it to go across the room so you can step on the only other platform that's there and do the same thing. This kind of thing. There's never any clever use of the environment or unique areas to admire. You can get elemental keys which open up colored doors, which I think was supposed to be a game-spanning mechanic, but it must have been a real rush job because you find the last two of them in these awkwardly shoehorned dungeons towards the ass end of the game. Everything just feels really disconnected. A big part of the problem is the game's visual design. The game just doesn't have a strong art style in the way that many other old-school From games do. There is some of that early 3D uncanniness which can work in the game's favor, but it can't transcend its dullness. Once again, looking back to the game's PS2 cohorts, take the Ancient City. That game's texture work gives its world this tangible layer of griminess, and there's just a pervasive feeling of darkness in the use of that heavy black fog everywhere. Shadow Tower Abyss floods your screen with garish bloom lighting and utilizes unnatural colors and motion blur to create a strange atmosphere. My point is that even in the early days of the PS2, From had a great sense of how best to use the hardware to communicate a specific style. I'm inclined to cut Eternal Ring a bit of slack being a launch title and all, but even From's other launch title, EverGrace, has more appealing visuals. I can deal with the weaker technical details, but the lighting and colors here are just so flat that it really kills the game's potential to be visually interesting. Even the more vibrant parts of the world look dull in a way that doesn't feel intentional. The dungeons have almost nothing by way of static objects or decorations to make them feel like actual locations. They're just big empty square rooms connected to big empty square rooms. It's not a good sign when I feel excited to see bookshelves in the library level. I know it seems like I'm harping on graphics a lot, but you have to understand such a major part of what makes early FromSoft games stand out is their atmosphere, and visuals are a big part of that. The original Shadow Tower can't stack up with any modern game technically, but I'd put it toe-to-toe with almost anything in terms of sheer dreadful ambience. The game looks exactly the way it ought to look to do what it's trying to do. That's the power of strong direction, which is something that just seems to be lacking across the board in Eternal Ring. In trying to simplify and broaden the Kingsfield formula, it never really develops into its own thing. It has a lot of rings, but they're seldom used in interesting ways. It has plenty of dungeons, but they're not enjoyable to play through. None of its ideas develop. Combat feels decent relative to Kingsfield, but there are barely any weapons to experiment with. The game establishes a more JRPG-adjacent style with towns, shops, and healers, and then the town explodes and you never really need to deal with any of that stuff again. There's a side quest early on to help some guy find his fallen comrade's bracelet, and then that's the only side quest. The game already doesn't have a lot going for it, and that meager substance is stretched over like 12 dungeons, so monotony is just inevitable here. One area in which the game is decidedly different from other early From games is its storytelling. As I've mentioned, it's much more traditional, but it's also executed in a really weird way. The voice actors sound like they're doing an audition rather than a final read, like they don't know what's going on. Characters are introduced without context and then usually die shortly after.
Maybe, I don't know, for the benefit of Hungaria or their own greed. I don't know. I have no idea what they want with such power.
That was, some pretty strong, ad-libbing. Hate to see him go, but love to watch him leave. And he's dead. Everybody in this story seemingly wants the Eternal Ring, but nobody really knows what it is. They all just know that it grants limitless power. There are age-old conflicts between warring factions, but you never really get a sense for what that's meant in Eternal Ring's world or why it matters to you, until the latter part of the game, that is, when things get somewhat more interesting. Long ago, there was a battle between the magically inclined people of Solcia and the expansionist empire of Aldine. The battle took place on this very island, although both armies seemingly disappeared with little trace. It turns out that before the battle ended, the Solcians transformed the army of Aldine into monsters. Eventually, you find out that the Eternal Ring isn't a literal ring, but a magical prison created by the progenitors of the Solcians. When the Solcians found the ring, they got real excited because it meant that they could beat the Aldeans, but then they turned into dragons because the Eternal Ring was actually imprisoning a magical baby who thought it would be funny if he turned everyone into dragons, and he was right. It's hilarious. Also, the magical baby is voice acted by a real-life magical baby.
Let's talk about this boring stuff tomorrow. Let's talk about other stuff, like the babies of seabirds.
Why waste money on union voice actors when the CEO of Agetech has a perfectly good nephew who will spend the afternoon in the booth for a Capri Sun?
Yippee!
There's a reason that children don't usually do voice work as children, and that's because children stink. Well, usually. The reason that amazing child actors are celebrated isn't because they're amazing relative to Daniel Day-Lewis, it's because they don't stink. And that's so rare that it's worth celebrating. That's why when they become adults, everyone says, well, now you're just an average actor, so we don't love you anymore, and we're only interested in you if you're doing something self-destructive. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, the baby. The baby is funny, it adds a lot to the game, but again, in a From Software way. Some of the concepts explored in the story have potential, but everything about the way it's told undermines any potential for sincere intrigue. Characters don't have any personality and then they just die anyway. A lot of the ancient history, which is almost cool, is told to you in these long, multi-part monologues. In the end, you fight Baby, then break Baby out of prison. Why Baby is in Dish? What the fuck? Oh, he's rising.
I can't move. This has never happened to me before.
He's on the move, Kane.
Lila,
This baby's caretaker's name was Lila, and 70% of this ending sequence is just the baby saying her name.
Lila, 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 Lila.
She's dead, by the way. Everybody dies.
Please, Lila. This feeling. Ah.
You mustn't forget to enjoy the precious time you spend with your baby. After all, he won't be a baby for long. Pretty soon, he'll grow up to become a super baby.
This
Is death.
His smile and innocence destroyed. Anyway, the baby becomes Kane's giant-headed friend, and everyone lives happily ever after. There's a reason why Eternal Ring's name is seldom mentioned when talking about From's first-person dungeon crawlers. That's because it's not very good. There are some good ideas present here, but those ideas never evolve or interact with each other in ways that elevate the repetitive gameplay. When I was a boy, my mom bought me a piece of software called the 3D Game Maker. Basically, you could pick from a bunch of ready-made models and slot together prefab environments to quote-unquote make a game. Eternal Ring's dungeons remind me a great deal of the games I made in that software. Dull hallways connecting empty rooms, enemies placed without thought for interesting tailored challenges, mechanical concepts like poison areas or changing water levels that never amount to anything beyond minor annoyances. There's a decent variety of enemy designs and behaviors, and I can't deny that the ring and magic system are cool to mess around with for some time. But at its core, Eternal Ring is just a mediocre dungeon crawler, and a game that I would only recommend if you absolutely adore Kingsfield and need more from Fromsoft themselves. If the number of requests I've received to review this game are any indication, then you may already be familiar with Akuma Kira's Lunacid. This game spent some time in early access before its final release in October of 2023, and it's done very well since then. It seems like Lunacid was ahead of the pack in terms of the whole Kingsfield renaissance. You want proof that it's inspired by Kingsfield? Okay, it says inspired by Shadow Tower and Kingsfield in the Steam description, alright? Does that cut it? Look, it also has that compass where everybody leaves a comment saying it looks like it's gonna say sex. It's just south and east, people, grow up. There's a lot of other things too, but you know, that's a good enough start. The intro to Lunacid gives us a glimpse at the world's origin story, at least the origin of how it is now, and it's quite compelling. A gargantuan creature emerges from the sea and begins to spew poison across the world, transforming it into an apocalyptic landscape where people fight for survival. It's all explained to us with a wonderfully hammy title crawl.
Corrupting everything it reached, the poison fog slowly transformed the world and brought about a new age.
You'll never be him.
Brightly does the fire of light burn within your heart, Austin Lyle Forrester.
Don't feel bad. Nobody can be. We learn of the Great Well, a hole in the earth leading to deaths heretofore unknown, where undesirables are cast. Apparently, I'm undesirable, so they dump me in here, and the game begins. Shortly thereafter, we're acquainted with a hub area and its friendly inhabitants, then sent on our way to find an escape from the Great Well, if one even exists. What's that? Lunacid? Oh, I've been saying it all wrong. Okay, it's Lunacid. My bad, everybody. This entire introductory sequence really captures the imagination, thanks largely to some great music and cinematography, which complements the lo-fi visuals. There's a sense of mystery and curiosity which abounds throughout Lunacid, and that's established very early on. Gameplay-wise, this will be a familiar experience to anyone who's played a Kingsfield, but the game does step outside of that framework quite a bit. In terms of similarities, the basics sync up. It's a first-person game with a focus on melee combat. Different weapons have different properties, and which ones you prefer to use largely comes down to playstyle. Some are incredibly fast, others are lumbering, some deal elemental damage, some are ranged, you get the picture. Rather than waiting for a bar to fill before swinging for maximum damage, you hold down the attack button to charge your swings. You have to manage your attack timing and dance around enemies, waiting for this bar to fill to maximize your weapon's potential. There are also many magic abilities which aren't learned by leveling up, but acquired through rings which can be found throughout your journey. You can equip 2 weapons and 2 spells at any given time, which can then be quick-swapped. A major difference between those classic From games and Lunacid is the leveling system. Each time you level up, you gain points which can be allocated into the stats of your choosing. For example, strength increases your weapon damage, intelligence boosts your mana pool, speed increases your movement speed, and dexterity increases your jump height. Everybody who said this game was like Kingsfield lied. You can jump, your movement speed is reasonable and can be made even faster? The game isn't even locked at 20 frames per second. Oh wait, that actually is an option in the menu. Okay, I like Kingsfield, but what kind of a twisted person would choose this? Look, the moment you design a game to be played with a keyboard and a mouse, it's already stepping well outside of the Shadow Tower Kingsfield paradigm. Probably the single most important aspect of movement and combat in those games is feeling like you're punching somebody in a dream. There's a torpidity to the movement in those games, and basically everything is designed around it. When somebody says they can't get into Kingsfield or that the game is too difficult or slow to be enjoyed, that's probably what they're referring to. If you were to jack up that movement speed to modern standards or mod the game for mouse look, the experience would be so different on such a fundamental level that you wouldn't even be playing the game as intended. Even changing the controls via emulation is already a bridge too far for some purists. All of that to say, Lunacid and really any Kings-like game that allows you to play with a mouse and keyboard have gameplay intentions that are already far removed from their inspirations. It's not an inherently bad thing at all, it's just an observation. The minute modern controls are implemented, you're not designing around the main character's turn speed feeling like they're in fucking soup. In Lunacid's case, it's more about quick reflexes, utilizing the environment, adapting to new enemy types, and targeting particular parts of an enemy's body. On that note, there is a sort of Shadow Tower Abyss adjacent dismemberment system with some of the game's enemies, and that can be interesting. These mummies can be troublesome in the early game, so the temptation is always to aim for their head, which is their weak spot. Only doing that, sometimes you'll decapitate them, which completely removes their weak spot, so you may be better off targeting its body, and saving its head is the coup de grace. This principle carries over for a good number of the game's enemies. Many can't be dismembered, but even those enemies typically have weak spots, or at least elements that they're weak to. Seeking out these weaknesses and aiming carefully for them makes for a more engaging style of combat than simply swinging and backing away for a few seconds, letting your bar refill ad nauseum. Combat is going to be the bulk of the game, but there's a pretty good variety in gameplay throughout. Each of the levels are self-contained and separated with a loading screen. They're connected in a way that feels reminiscent of Kingsfield 3. Some zones have 2 or 3 exits which can lead to different areas, each with a checkpoint that allows for fast travel between levels or back to the hub. There's almost always some kind of unique hook to each area. The accursed tomb is dark and enemies are invisible until you light 3 giant torches. Up until then, you have to practice avoidance and use one of your weapon slots to carry a torch or cast a light spell. In Castle Les Fanu, different areas can only be accessed with the right key, forcing you to explore and make note of doors you've already seen. The Boiling Grotto is not only full of lava, but a huge Egyptian-style complex full of some pretty devious traps. There's also a Daggerfall skeleton in here. I'd recognize that screech from a mile away. There's almost always some twist to the gameplay when you reach a new area. Nothing that really alters the experience, but just a little variety to keep things interesting. At its core, the game is all about exploring, fighting enemies, and finding items. There's a surprisingly large list of weapons and spells that can be found. The fact that so many of them are unique and worth using is actually pretty impressive. A lot of the time in games like this, there's a linear progression with weapons or armor that makes your old gear feel redundant. Here, because of how non-linear the game world is, lots of weapons stay useful long after you found them. There's a flail with 3 spiked balls on it. That already rules, because flails are cool, especially when you're cleric maxing. Each ball has its own collider, which deals its own flat damage number, so it's effectively a melee shotgun. The closer you are and the more of your balls smash against an enemy's chin, the more damage you do. The Blessed Wing Sword swings as fast as you can hit the attack button. It's like semi-automatic. So even though its damage is fairly low, you can go full anime superior speed mode against enemies, which is exhausting for your mouse finger, but it's also really cool. There are some obvious wink-wink, nudge-nudge weapons like the Shadow Blade, which, like its Kingsfield 1 inspiration, does great damage but blinds your character. If you make it through a grueling combat gauntlet, you can even find Moonlight, a clear reference to the Moonlight Sword from the Fromsoft classic 3D dot game heroes. Even the standard weapons sometimes have a level-up mechanic. If you use a weapon for a long enough time, you can bring it to a grave back at the hub and transform it into a new, more powerful version. This isn't applicable with every weapon, and it's not a particularly deep upgrade system, but it's a nice incentive to play with weapons you may not otherwise consider. The weapon selection is one of my favorite parts of Lunacid. I just like seeing how the game can change depending on how you're armed, and it's something that really alters your experience. One player might get something approximating Kingsfield, while another player with high speed and a crossbow is basically getting the Duke Nukem 3D experience. You've got a lot of magic options too, and there's a ton of fun to be had there. Lightning, fireball, stuff like that is always helpful, but then there's summoning familiars to fight with you, creating coffins that you can use during platforming segments, lithomancy, which makes inanimate objects start screaming, and various blood spells which eat up your health instead of your mana. Magic in general feels like an extension of melee combat. The two systems complement each other and add a further degree of personalization. Even though there's no armor or accessories, the volume of weapons and magic makes loot hunting fun. By the end of the game, you'll be so decked out with cool stuff that the tables will be completely turned, which is actually kind of a problem. For me, the game was at its best when I was creeping around a new area full of intimidating foes, never straying too far from that checkpoint in case I needed to save my game and refill my health. However, it won't be long before you become a killing machine. Once you crank up your speed or dexterity and find some decent ranged weapons or magic, the game becomes much less intense as you cruise around steamrolling enemies. Part of this, I think, is just how quickly you gain levels and also how the different areas can be tackled in any order. It's very difficult to balance such a game. In an effort to keep things fair, some of the later game enemies and bosses just have huge health bars that take forever to chew through. Past the halfway point, I frequently felt like I was simultaneously too weak to progress, but also not in any real danger. It'd be easy to fall into a routine of using the same weapons and magic to clear out rooms, which is why it's good that the weapons and magic are so much fun that you actively want to experiment with them, even if it's not optimal. Regardless, after the early game, I never quite found that difficulty sweet spot again. Perhaps that was my cue to play the game at 20 FPS, but by God, I'm just not doing it, Lunacid. I'm not doing it. Moving through new zones is still enjoyable, and that's largely thanks to the game's eccentric style. The atmosphere here is the star of the show. It's just a visual and auditory candy store, endless vibes from the beginning until the end. On a technical level, the graphics here are somewhere between a PS1 and a PS2 game, with some modern rendering techniques. The unfiltered textures and fog distance evoke the PS1, while the model quality, lighting, and physics are generally well above that system's pay grade. Levels are painted with unusual colors, which creates a psychedelic feeling that stays with you throughout the game, even in some of the more normal-looking areas. In terms of that mood, it's really not like anything I've ever played. There's always a clever use of subtle effects to give each area fingerprints of their own. Things like those Kokiri sprites floating around the forest area, the heat waves distorting your vision in the boiling grotto, or the manually placed light shafts drawing your attention to particular places of interest. Then there's these unique flourishes, like the way the bookshelves in the archives have this funhouse mirror distortion, kind of a Fantasia-like zaniness, complete with malevolent flying books. The small things too, like the way objects shake and bounce when you smack them, or the animation on the location name pop-up text. Stuff like this goes a long way in making everything feel cohesive and charming. The game looks consistently unnatural, but it's never garish or unpleasant, unless that's the intended effect, which it sometimes is. There are these great unscripted moments where you're just overwhelmed with this feeling of curiosity towards what's going on in front of you. There's always a temptation with PS1 style games to just grab some photo textures, reduce them to 64 by 64 pixels, you slap a dithering filter over the screen and call it a day. I'm completely outing myself with that, by the way, but Lunacid's visuals always feel very carefully considered. If you name any of the levels in this game, my mind will immediately conjure an image of that environment, which is pretty impressive considering how many different levels there actually are here. As far as the soundtrack goes, it's just wall-to-wall bangers. Every area has at least one sick-ass theme song, often more, and I don't think there's a dud in this entire OST. The soundtrack was a collaborative effort composed by the developer Kira, Thor High Heels, Jaren Christ, Astra Vrisk, and Jeffrey Norden. As such, there is a contrast between the different tracks and their styles, but this doesn't really bother me. It's reminiscent of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, where you have these upbeat, funky, high-energy tracks giving you a rhythm to go smashing heads to, but then there's plenty of dark, odd-sounding tracks that are just much moodier, sometimes approaching that droning territory where the hairs on the back of your neck are standing up. Do the groovier tracks undercut some of the game's haunting atmosphere? You could make an argument, but the music itself is great, and there's a really sensible balance of moods. There's a huge variety here, and it's almost irritatingly good in its totality. I was just like waiting for a crappy track to start playing. The game is also full of different monsters, some of which have some truly wild designs. As a matter of fact, much like Shadow Tower, I found much of the fun in Lunacid was seeing what sorts of enemies were gonna show up next. One of my favorites are these spirit creatures in the forest, which are rendered with a background layer that makes them look like they're out of space-time, which is just way too cool. In the vein of Shadow Tower, there's also plenty of enemies with this incongruent Lovecraftian style, all these weird appendages that are probably used for something, but you'd almost rather not know what. They're accompanied by good sound design too, nice and crispy, which suits the visual style. There's also a good feedback sound when you hit an enemy's weak spot. It's always nice to hear. As for the story, it definitely sits in the background compared to the RPG norm, but there's a bit more interaction than the typical Kingsfield games. Characters will regale you with tales of ages past, but the context will need to be gleaned from various in-game sources. Certain NPC side quest dialogue or hidden notes will contain nuggets of info that allow you to piece together this world's sordid past. In a very From style, even item descriptions can help fill in the blanks. There's a mystical and Lovecraftian underpinning to the entire thing, ending on a deliberately confusing note. You spend time pondering the nature of the well, and as you move forward, reflect on whether or not you even actually want to leave. There are a handful of characters, and while they only periodically have a part to play in the proceedings, they're still a memorable bunch, especially in their visual designs. It's apparently a matter of contention whether or not some of the cutesier designs fit within Lunacid, but honestly, the game doesn't really have a unified sense of seriousness outside of the friendly NPCs, so I think they fit okay. Demi has the most active presence in the game, bringing you to the hub for the first time and showing up here and there to offer musings and advice. There's a skeleton guy who tells long-winded stories, which is a primo character archetype. You've also got the Siegmeyer-esque Garrett the Hound, a good-natured knight whose optional story can be advanced. I really like the Banjo-Kazooie style verbling and gurgling they do in lieu of voice acting too. It's all very charming. The plot makes for a cool backdrop, but I would not describe it as a central reason to play Lunacid. The writing is a bit sloppy in terms of grammar, and sometimes diction feels a little first drafty. When you're playing an affordable game made by a solo dev, you do well to alter your expectations anyway, but it's worth mentioning. Aside from feeling a low-grade sense of mystery, which certainly isn't without value, there were no particular questions I felt a burning desire to get the answers to. No reinvention of the wheel story-wise, but it's good enough, and the atmosphere really elevates it. Exploration and world design are critical components of a game like this, and it's here where I have some mixed feelings. These areas are gorgeous and often fun to explore. Some may disagree, but I like how stats and magical traversal spells actually affect your ability to interact with the environment. Boosting your speed and dexterity will allow you to reach heights you couldn't normally, and even if you don't level up those stats, there are spells you can use like summoning coffins or wind dash. You've also got Icarian Flight, which does the same thing that it does in Morrowind, but without the massive head trauma. Being able to reach otherwise inaccessible points of interest just by being crafty with your skills and tools always feels satisfying, and the rewards for doing so are typically worth it. This to me is a good example of a nice evolution on the sort of basic framework this game shares with Kingsfield. Like I've already mentioned, the unique challenges you're given in these zones are also a nice way of introducing some variety. There's always some new way to engage with the game. Even if these aren't sweeping mechanical changes, they're a great way of breaking up the monotony of dungeon crawling, which is important because dungeon crawling is effectively the entire game. In terms of the breadth of its content, Lunacid is a surprisingly meaty game. A single playthrough isn't too long, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 hours, maybe less if you're cruising. But the number of different areas, which are all distinct from one another, is damn impressive. What makes the skeletal structure of Lunacid kinda weird is that if your goal is to finish the game, you only have to participate in a relatively small percentage of the content here. Many areas, both hidden and otherwise, only exist for the sake of plundering, the simple joy of exploration, or achieving goals to trigger one of the game's alternative endings. This is a game that's dad-gummed fixin' to burst with secrets. We're not just talking about the sort of cryptic side quests you'd find in a Souls game, although that's present too. I'm talking entire dungeons, which lead to other entire dungeons on par with any of the game's main offerings that are totally optional and, in fact, often very difficult to find. I find myself baffled by this decision, but also with great respect for it. This is an indie game made by a solo developer over several years, which costs a pittance. It's like $14 or less when it's on sale. Most solo developers would struggle to fill a game with enough tasty playable nougat to justify an asking price, and here Lunacid is just like totally unconcerned with whether or not you even experience most of it. The absolute chutzpah. I love secrets, and I love replayability, especially in games like this. Kingsfield and Shadow Tower are straightforward affairs when compared to their chief inspiration, Ultima Underworld, but one thing they did not skimp on is the secrets. There's something perpetually hype-inducing about having a hunch over a conspicuous wall and being rewarded for obeying your gut instinct. It's not only a welcome aspect of games like this, but it's a really important one. A good secret has some kind of signal. Perhaps an ersatz texture gives something away. Maybe the wall is flanked with ornamental objects like torches, giving you the sense that there may be more than meets the eye. Sometimes it's okay to have a secret that's just totally out of left field, especially if it's holding particularly valuable loot. But I think this sort of thing should be used sparingly, or else you encourage the player to spend 80% of their time in-game butting up against walls and hitting the interact button. Many of Lunacid's secrets are well hidden, and in far more creative ways than in most dungeon crawlers. But all the same, many of its secrets, some of which are not optional to find, are unreasonably well hidden and had me resorting to online walkthrough material more often than I care to admit. A big problem wraps back around to what I mentioned earlier. It's impossible to know what areas are optional and what are mandatory. On some level, this encourages cautious exploration, which is a core aspect of any Kingsfield game I've played. On the other hand, there's a creeping frustration that affected my experience negatively. When you complete a section in a Kingsfield or a Shadow Tower, whether you're activating a quest trigger or finding an item, it's usually clear when you're done. There may be more to find if you stick around and continue to explore, but it's rare that you'll spend an inordinate amount of time thinking to yourself, am I done? Is there more? Am I allowed to leave? Did I miss an exit somewhere? In Lunacid, the sheer volume of secrets and optional branching areas, as well as how they're presented just the same as story importance zones, make it perennially unclear when you're actually progressing. You spend a lot of time feeling like you're in the dark, sometimes literally. There are pros and cons to having an in-game map, and it's certainly not something I think that every game in this style needs. However, I think Lunacid would have benefited from the inclusion of one. Even if only a Thief-style map, hand-drawn and kind of inaccurate, just to give you a general idea of the layout and whether or not it's even connected to further areas, would have alleviated much of the guesswork that I found bothersome while playing the game. I frequently came up against dead ends in areas that I was almost positive would result in progression. Once that happens, it's anyone's guess which of the many levels you have to go back to, looking for forks in the road you might have missed. The exploration that follows your discovery of a new area is exhilarating because it feels like the possibilities have once again opened up. This sort of exploration, though, where you're retracing your steps across huge zones and looking for doorways or halls you might have missed, this just feels like a time sink. This is where Lunacid's indifference towards the player's progression teeters on the edge between impressive and obnoxious. It's all well and good that an optional secret area is insanely well hidden. That's in the great tradition of From's games. But that dynamic changes when you don't know whether or not it is an optional secret area or where the fuck you're supposed to go when you find out that it isn't. Eventually, all other options seemingly exhausted, I just have to ask the internet, how do I get past this giant door? Well, first of all, the giant door, not the right way apparently. But also, there's a book beside it that says, I have sealed the worst of the Golden Lance's damage in the clock tower. Then you're supposed to shoot a poison or darkness spell at this window. Why though? Is this a clock tower? I don't see a clock anywhere. There's just often not a clear, logical chain of deduction to follow, to the point where some things feel kind of arbitrary, cryptic for the sake of cryptic. It's a bit of a sore spot for me because this is such a great game in so many ways, and much of that greatness is locked away behind puzzles that I found unreasonable. I just found myself regularly thinking, well, how the hell was I supposed to know that? Maybe I'm exposing myself as a baby-brained casual who needs his clock towers covered with yellow paint and boo-boo keys. I won't discount that possibility. And hey, the artistic intent behind the game can indeed be to confuse and bemuse, but good difficulty and good puzzles are crafts all their own, and I was not comprehensively taken by Lunacid's approach to these. Let me be clear, I wouldn't really care if Lunacid didn't kick some degree of ass. I would have just said, what the hell? What were they thinking? Like the great irate gamer himself. In the grand scheme of things, does any of this ruin Lunacid? No, not even close. This is still a very good game. I love Kingsfield. I find it enjoyable to play, I find it intriguing, and I find it to be a satisfying challenge to overcome. I would not, as a rule, describe Kingsfield as fun. Lunacid is fun. Movement feels great, the combat is simple but enjoyable, and there's a lot to discover here. There's a steady trickling of new and inventive tools that stays interesting, which is a feat in itself. Just as some of those game systems begin to feel a bit long in the tooth, the credits roll and you're left satisfied. It's just a good feeling game, not only in the act of gameplay but in the moods it conveys. The game takes Kingsfield's brutalism and dunks it in pomegranate juice spiked with LSD. The result is something truly unique. The name Lunacid kind of evokes it best. It's a moonlit, phantasmagorical world that's enjoyable to explore, providing you can crack its sometimes unreasonable codes. Lunacid's good qualities shine through, a worthy standard bearer for the modern Kings-like, and a game that I would not hesitate to recommend. Lo and behold, about a year and a half later, Kira released a short prequel to Lunacid titled Tears of the Moon. This is noteworthy for two reasons. The first of these is that Tears of the Moon is totally free to play on Steam, which is awesome. The second is that rather than being developed in the Unity engine like the original games, Tears of the Moon was made in the Sword of Moonlight Kingsfield making toolkit, which is also awesome. If you've seen my video on the Kingsfield games, you'll already be familiar with SOM. Unless it auto-played while you were asleep. Maybe you picked up on some of it by osmosis, I don't know. This was a piece of software released by From back in the year 2000. Basically, it acts as a comprehensive world editor, allowing users to create their own Kingsfield games using a suite of included or imported resources, and a simple interface that didn't require any programming on the user's part. It's a real oddity. I mean, just the fact that it exists. Kingsfield sold fine, but it wasn't a particularly popular series, even in Japan. So the concept of commercially releasing an editor which allows people to make their own Kingsfield games is just strange. Back in 2000, the PC wasn't a popular choice as a gaming platform in Japan either. As an analog to this, the RPG Maker series, which was very popular in Japan, had console releases as late as 2005, because that's where most of the audience was. Interestingly, RPG Maker was also localized by Aegitech, who was in charge of translating the Kingsfield games, but that's neither here nor there. Even to this day, Sword of Moonlight is a fairly obscure corner of the Kingsfield omnibus. In spite of that, there is an active fanbase that continues to produce games and update the engine to maintain its compatibility with modern systems. All of that said, building a prequel to Lunacid on this engine is a pretty rad idea, not only because old technology is fun, and it is, but it works on another level too. We're getting to see the before times of Lunacid's world, and as such, experiencing it in a much more abstract and rudimentary format. It's sort of meta in that way. It's also nice that it's free because despite the updates, this engine does show its age. The controller rebinding menu is literally an INI file, and in order to even run properly, the game utilizes a Voodoo 2 graphics card wrapper. The in-game movies looked like this for me, and OBS doesn't even recognize the game. I just had to screen record my entire monitor. But hey, it works, and you can even play in high resolution with a modern controller. It's a Kingsfield game, alright. Fuck. If you're looking to scratch that Kingsfield itch and nothing but the authentic article will do the trick, Tears of the Moon is for you. For all intents and purposes, this is a Kingsfield game as much as it is a Lunacid game. All the guts are here, and so the gameplay is very familiar. The emphasis in combat is once again on circle strafing and waiting for a stamina bar to refill. Your character automatically levels up again, meaning no stats, no alternative character speed, no jump height, no jumping at all. Back in my day, there was no Z-axis, and we liked it. What you see is what you get, and there is a refreshing simplicity in that. It's been a while since I've hopped back into a Kingsfield game, so I went into Tears of the Moon primarily expecting a novelty. A game made on this creaky old engine? Well, that's neat. But actually, there is something special about this formula, stripped down to its bare essentials. I can't lay the credit squarely at the feet of the engine, of course. There's a lot of original assets and what I assume are programmatic tricks at work here. Kira did a great job of recreating that classic Fromsoft feeling while adding enough artistic identifiers to make clear that this is a Lunacid game. If you're interested in the lore of the main game, there's a bit to chew on here regarding a plot-important character and event. But for the most part, Tears of the Moon is a quiet, gameplay-centric experience. It's short, which is understandable given the circumstances, but what's here is pretty nice. There are about 5 or 6 areas to explore, very reminiscent of the PS1 Kingsfield games. Less open, expansive, and intertwining, more straightforward and maze-like. You'll typically wander into a dungeon, fighting enemies, maybe a boss, then find a key or a magical trinket, allowing you to double back and access previously blocked off areas. There are still secret doors to find, and in typical Lunacid fashion, there's apparently an entire optional area that I just missed completely, but I'll take responsibility for that one. Either way, it's a more straightforward affair here. You're usually after 1 or 2 MacGuffins on each map, and then it's off to the next in a relatively linear sequence. There's a decent variety of enemies and even some familiar swag you can acquire. Triple Fang, how I have missed ye. But going from Lunacid back to this really reinforces my appreciation for all the different combat mechanics in the original game. There's only so much you can do with Kingsfield's base combat system, and Tears pretty much does it. Nothing to write home about in that department, but nothing to complain about because this game is exactly what it purports to be. And even in spite of those engine limitations, the game does still carry that trademark atmosphere with it, one that's wholly different from the original Lunacid. The geometry, lighting, and textures are all much simpler, harkening back to those uncanny 5th-gen console vibes. The original assets created for this game also fit in perfectly. You could have told me that this came out in 1998, and I wouldn't second guess you. There's not much more to it than that. Tears of the Moon is a bare essential Kingsfield experience with a Lunacid coat of paint. It's not surprising that the two are perfectly compatible. It has all the good and bad aspects of an early Kingsfield experience in a bite-sized package, and without costing a dime. For what it is, it's great. More than anything, it's just cool to see this engine being utilized in a quote-unquote legitimate project, and there's a whole world of these sort of Moonlight games out there, so King's heads rejoice, our time has come. I'm sure nobody would have imagined 25 years ago that we'd still be getting games made with the sort of Moonlight software. I wouldn't recommend this one to just anybody, but if you're a die-hard fan of Kingsfield, it's a no-brainer. Right now, I'd like to take a brief intermission to talk about not a Kings-like game, but a Kingsfield game. If you've watched my Kingsfield video, you'll know that in the mid-2000s, Fromsoft released a number of Kingsfield games for cell phones. These games were developed using the Doja API, which was a Java-based technology available exclusively over the iMode network in Japan, which is kind of a proto-smartphone service. It's pretty convoluted, which doesn't make the job of explaining what Kingsfield Mobile even is any easier. Unlike its contemporary-ish Kingsfield Additional series on the PSP, the mobile games adhered more closely to the mainline game's design philosophies. Or at least it seems that way, based on descriptions and screenshots. Unfortunately, descriptions and screenshots are all we have to go off of. For many years, the KF mobile games have been considered lost media, and it's no wonder. Between the relative obscurity of Kingsfield and the specificity of the platform these games were released on, getting these games playable again seems unlikely. Sourcing a mid-2000s Japanese flip phone with Kingsfield Mobile already installed on it, then somehow backing up that ROM and emulating it, it's a pretty big ask. It's something that many people, myself included, took for granted probably would never happen. It's a good thing then that there exist people out there with greater faith and more gumption than I. Kingsfield Mobile has been found, and thanks to the straightforward emulation available via the Keitai World Launcher, it's even playable. Now, only one of the 3 mobile games have been recovered, but that's a great start, and an incredible victory for both Kingsfield fans and preservationists. It'd be great to hunt down not only the remaining 2 KF mobile games, but any of From's mobile output from this time, including several Lost Armored Core and Tenchu games. If you know somebody with an extensive collection of old Japanese flip phones in their attic, report to your local Kingsfield constabulary post-haste. For now, I wanted to take a brief look at Kingsfield Mobile, and I do mean brief because there's not too much to talk about here. When I first fired up this game, I was under the impression that it was a demake of the original Kingsfield. The layout of the first area is almost identical, down to the skeleton hiding behind the same invisible wall. Except now I'm convinced he's unkillable. I was here for like 20 minutes. These skeletons are making a fool out of me. But it won't be long before any notions of mobile being a recreation of the first game are dispelled. This is an original work. This game takes the bare basic fundamentals of Kingsfield and translates them into a game that could be controlled with this phone.
Oh my god!
You can only equip weapons and armor, no magic to speak of. Rather than each level having a massive, complex map with intersecting routes and tons of secrets to find, the levels here are very simple mazes, like back of the Captain Crunch box simple. Obviously, the game looks, like this.
God.
But I can't rag on the visuals too much. Yes, it runs at a minuscule resolution. Yes, the levels are comprised of 1 or 2 textures. But man, this was a 2004 flip phone game. Looking at the games most companies were getting away with at this point, actually this Splinter Cell game looks kind of cool. Hoisted by my own petard with that one. This looks way nicer than fucking Kingsfield. I want to play this. Anyway, it may not be the most visually appealing, but getting Kingsfield real-time full 3D world on a flip phone was still a mighty impressive feat. It does an admirable job of recapturing the original game's style, and in fact I think it reuses some models from that original game. The problem with KF Mobile is that there's just nothing to it. Enemy behaviors, no surprise, are very simple, and the levels are just so flat and uninteresting. They occasionally throw something new at you, like this level where there's invisible floors. The statue at the beginning says, "There's nothing to fear, step forward with courage," but then every time I step forward with courage, I fucking die. That's the exact sound I made when I realized I had to restart from my last save. And restarting really sucks here because of how slow the game is. Even more than usual, it moves at a languid pace, and having to clear out levels multiple times because of an unfair death just kills what little momentum the game has. From the uninteresting levels to the lack of magic, the whole game makes me appreciate what a great start Kingsfield 1 actually was for the series. So many people write it off because it's such a simplistic experience compared with what would come next, but it did set a strong foundation with plenty of room to build upward. It could have been worse. It could have been much worse. Even though Kingsfield Mobile might be the worst official Kingsfield experience, it's amazing to see it found and be made playable. This kind of preservation is important, not specifically because it gives the average Joe convenient access to a mediocre game. It's because through getting to experience a developer's output in its entirety, we can piece together context, giving us a clearer sense of how things evolved and developed. Not only for the developer's games, but the video game industry in general. These forgotten nooks of a company's history are the easiest to disregard and therefore the most important to grab onto while we still can. For the sake of posterity, this playable copy of Kingsfield Mobile is a damn achievement, and we should be happy that we have access to it. Monomyth on paper is a recipe for disaster. It's an open-ended dungeon-crawling RPG with immersive sim elements being developed by a single person, kickstarted for less than 40,000 euros. I hate to be the cynic, but my god, how many overly ambitious Kickstarter video game projects need to crash and burn before you look at something like this and think to yourself, this is going nowhere fast. 100? 1,000? A billion? Well, it's been a long road for Monomyth. This game was successfully kickstarted back in 2021, but it had been in development for many years before that. The lead and only developer, Michael A. Trolls, developed Monomyth in his spare time while working at his quote-unquote real job, before moving to Monomyth full-time, now under the studio banner of Rat Tower Software. Comparing early screenshots of the game to recent promotional materials gives you an idea of how far this game has come in the past decade. Relatively speaking, 40,000 euros might seem like a good chunk of change to some, but when you're developing a video game, that kind of money is burned quickly. That's why Kickstarter projects that net hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars have the propensity to explode. Rat Tower's decision to keep development to a solo endeavor outside of the occasional contract work may have resulted in slower development for Monomyth, but it's also been more sustainable. Over the years, backers and Steam wishlisters have received a steady trickling of updates and vlogs, until at last on October 3rd of 2024, the game released into early access on Steam and GOG. Since then, the game has had plenty of smaller fixes and some much larger updates, but it's still under active development. This is not a finished game. The development of Monomyth is a battle of attrition being fought by one guy in Austria whose stubbornness has prevented another Kickstarter casualty. Now, I would describe the game as being much closer to Ultima Underworld or Arx Fatalis than I would Kingsfield, but the fieldness is still with us here. First of all, the logo design is pretty unmistakable. You've got King's Herbs, which bear a striking resemblance to herbs from King's Field. You've also got rhombus keys, and I mean, that's enough for me to call it a Kings-like, because have you ever seen a rhombus key in a game that isn't Kingsfield? Character creation is pretty simple. You've got attributes which dictate your character's overall strengths and weaknesses, as well as a list of skills allowing you to fine-tune your playstyle. None of these portraits are really speaking to me, but thankfully you can add your own. Oh hell yeah. The game is set in the kingdom of Ariath. At some point in the past, a great calamity forced the people of Ariath underground where they established cities and colonies. This concept will be pretty recognizable to anyone who's played Ultima Underworld or Arx Fatalis. Our protagonist's father sent an expedition to the city of Lysandria where a relic called the Primeval Seed is held. It can apparently quell the perpetual storms topside, which would allow for a wide-scale return to the world above. The King's group is lost, so our hero decides to follow in their footsteps to find his brother who led the expedition and possibly bring back the primeval seed. In the great tradition of many a dungeon crawler, you're first tasked with escaping your prison cell, acting as a requisite tutorial. Once that's taken care of, the game is pretty open-ended. I would stop short of calling it open world because the levels are more self-contained and constructed with a particular flow, but it's all been designed so the player can complete tasks in a non-sequential order, much in keeping with Underworld's design. That said, it can all be a bit intimidating at first. There are many places you can go and a lot of mechanics to familiarize yourself with. The game is light on player guidance, at least by way of tutorials. Instead, you're encouraged to experiment and rely on context clues to figure things out for yourself. The story so far is okay. The writing is pretty stiff and the characters mostly exist to usher you to your next point of interest. At no point did I feel attached to any one character or interested in their individual stories, which makes it a lot easier to do things like this. I'm interested to see how the eponymous Monomyth will play into the story, as there aren't more than faint traces of the hero's journey at work here. Story isn't the priority, at least not in the early access version. Where Monomyth really focuses is in its gameplay, and in many important ways the game totally nails it. I went with a sort of cleric build again, focusing on blunt weapons and divine magic, and I had a really good time with it. In demos or early access games, I like to go with blunt weapons because I find blunt to be the most neglected category of armament. It's basically a shit test I put small developers through. If your game can do justice to blunt weapons, then that's a good sign. If the only worthwhile path is by training in swords, then you've failed. If you're a coward, then stealth is a viable option too. In fact, the Thief game seemed to be a chief inspiration for Monomyth, which makes me very happy because Thief kicks ass. The loudness of your footsteps depends on the materials of the floor you're walking on. There are water arrows which can be used to douse torches or even hurt fire-based enemies, and best of all, there's a Garrett-style ledge grab so you can pull yourself up to higher points. I don't know what madman of a solo developer would choose to pursue this design element. It's not only a difficult mechanic to program and implement, but one that forces you to change the way you design levels. Now there's an entirely different movement mechanic you have to consider when building environments. Between that and the variable jump height based on your character's athletic skill, there's a real hands-off approach to letting you navigate. You can even use that ledge grab to negate fall damage if you're accurate enough. Apropos of that, there's definitely an immersive sim design philosophy here. The world is a sandbox that you're meant to mess around with, and that's the best thing about Monomyth. There are the expected things. You can stack boxes or crates to reach higher areas depending on your strength attribute. You can open doors by finding a key, picking a lock, or if it's a wooden door, you can even blow it open with explosives or use your torch to set it on fire. You can use the heat from campfires or stoves to cook your meat or your mushrooms, enhancing their effects. You can heat up your gear at forges and hammer metallic equipment on an anvil to repair it. Because gear degrades quickly and good quality stuff is hard to come by, you start seeing anvils as little condition restore checkpoints, which is interesting. It's not really something I've seen in any other game. The sandbox extends to the combat system, which is serviceable on its own merits, but really fun when you try to break it, which to be clear is encouraged in Monomyth. Dark Messiah of Might and Magic was never mentioned as an influence on this game, but it does include a kick. It's not as spectacular as the one in Dark Messiah, but it's still pretty great. In fact, I would argue it's a little too great at times. Get over here, you rat bastard. Attaboy. The physics system makes for a lot of hilarious encounters. Bombs away! Hey, you can't kick it at him. Oh shit. I've got a rolling pin and I'm afraid to use it. If you can come up with a solution to a problem you're facing, you're very often vindicated. Like here, there's a trap that spits lethal fireballs at me. With the right timing, I can use it as a weapon against the enemies in this area, which is already pretty cool. I figure if I can hurry, I can stack some crates in front of it, which will block its view of me. Not only does this work like a charm, but if you stand in the peripheral vision of the trap, it'll spit a fireball at the crates, the impact of which causes enough explosive splash damage to destroy the trap itself. These moments of payoff at the emergent gameplay systems make me giddy. Unfortunately, even your best ideas may not always bear fruit. I don't know what I thought would happen. The combat mechanics are pretty simple, but they work well. Like Kingsfield, the focus here is primarily on stamina management. Swings, kicks, and successful blocks will all drain your stamina quickly, so you have to be smart about its utilization. As mentioned, the kick is a very powerful tool. Most enemies will be tipped flat on their ass with a kick, allowing you to get a whole bunch of hits in. Sometimes an enemy will retreat and drink a health vial, but for the most part their AI is quite predictable, and not necessarily in a bad way. Dealing with multiple enemies is a whole different kettle of fish, and that's where it pays to get creative with explosives or magic if you've invested in it. The magic system here is really cool. As you play, you'll find magic runes, or purchase them for exorbitant prices, which will then be added to your collection. Your runes are arranged in this pentagram and can be connected in a linear sequence to create constellations. Experimenting with these different rune combos is how you discover spells and add them to your spellbook. Some, like the magic dart or ignite spells, are very simple, but more complex spells can still be uncovered via trial and error, or by simply finding or purchasing the spell too. Once you discover a spell, it's added to your spellbook, but you can only have a few activated at a time, depending on your stats. With a spellbook equipped in your weapon slot, you can charge and cast spells while playing. Different spells belong to different schools of magic, so if you want to be fluent in all kinds of magic, you really need to devote yourself to casting and casting alone. Same goes for pretty much everything in Monomyth. It's important to commit to a build or you'll end up with a jack of no trades. Currently the game has a pretty solid list of spells, with many more to come as the game is developed by the looks of it. Spells like lightning are powerful, but mana is a limited resource and equipping a spellbook leaves you defenseless. It's a good trade-off, and I appreciate any RPG that actually makes you feel like a wizard, which Monomyth does a good job with. Given the size of the game world, the mark and recall spells are especially helpful, even though the sound effect for teleporting is unhinged. Sounds like my character is exploding and getting hit in the head with a frying pan at the same time. In order to refill your mana, you'll need flasks filled with the magic juice, and this flask system is very much analogous to Kingsfield 2. To refresh your memory, in that game you had a limited number of flasks which could be filled with healing or mana restoration potions. This gave you an infinite supply of potions, but only if you were willing to travel back to the fountains at the center of the game's world. It was sort of a proto-Estus flask system, and it's something that continues to set the second game apart. In Monomyth, you'll find indestructible flasks which can also be filled with either health or mana potions. The fountains for these are located throughout the game world, but are still relatively rare and take some time to recharge after you've filled a vial. It works nicely, and like the repair forges, you'll start making mental notes of where these fountains are located so you can swing by them as you explore. My only problem is that by the end I had tons of flasks. They should probably be a bit harder to come by. A key component in any dungeon crawler is its world design, and what we've got so far is pretty great. Like many other features of the game, I would liken the map design to Ultima Underworld. There are a handful of areas separated by loading screens, but they're large maps with plenty of smaller sub-areas inside of them, connected to each other via different passageways. The opening area, the Lysandrian Heartlands, is a great example of this. In the center, you'll find the cathedral. From there, connected by a network of rivers, each direction will take you to a different location. To the northeast, you'll find a massive door leading out of the Heartlands, which has been magically locked with runestones, giving you an ongoing mystery to solve. To the southeast, there's an underground farm which has been taken over by vagabonds. How you choose to deal with them, or if you even do at all, is up to you. To the southwest, you'll find a multi-level prison complex staffed by wastelanders, which are ostensibly the orcs of Monomyth. The map is densely packed, with very little downtime, so no matter which direction you head in, you'll inevitably find something interesting before long. The auto map also works well, and you can write your own notes via color-coded pins on the map, which is not only useful, but necessary. There's so much to do, so many secrets to find, people to talk to, and quests to undertake, that it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But as you play the game, you'll become familiar with most of these maps, to the point where I know the Heartlands like the back of my hand now. This points to another great aspect of Monomyth's design, which is that its environments never feel disposable. You'll be heading back and forth through areas many times, with progression rarely being a simple matter of moving on. To this end, you'll also unlock different shortcuts and gain access to teleporters. When you first see them, the teleporters will be kind of baffling. You'll see a locked door with these floating runic symbols above it with no real idea of what to do. As you progress and unlock teleporter rooms, you'll find that you can access previous areas by tuning these teleporter stones to the right combination of runes. It's a great method of fast travel that doesn't cheapen the experience, and it's also never explained to the player outright. It's only communicated via symbols that the player is left to intuit. It's a very immersive way of handling things, and it worked, at least for me. While the gameplay here is very different from your King's Fields in notable ways, I would say that these games do have quite a bit of common in the atmosphere primarily. In particular, Monomyth is very reminiscent of King's Field 4 and even Demon's Souls' Boletarian Palace area at times. There's a very severe grayscale quality to the environments that makes them feel oppressive and joyless in a way that suits the world. There are these brief moments of scale where you're just taken aback by some incredible sights, sounds, and moods. Getting to Lysandria and seeing this fortress spire reaching outside of the underground caverns into the sky above is just such a memorable sight. The wasteland above the underworld is also appropriately chilling. Everything feels dusty and abandoned, nothing but the constant rumbling of thunder and crows cawing. Now, a lot of indie games, especially those inspired by King's Field, tend to shoot for a more PS1 visual style. On top of serving the intended goal, it's attainable for the average solo developer. You don't need extensive modeling, texturing, and rigging experience to mock up a game that looks like this.
Oh my god, it's big.
Monomyth is the rare game that aims for higher visual fidelity, higher quality textures and materials, more realistic lighting and shadows, and detailed meshes. None of the models used in Monomyth are from an asset store, they're all original creations for the game. This is a bold choice indeed. It greatly increases the amount of time the developer has to spend on every visual element of the game. Yet, against the odds, Monomyth looks pretty good, with some concessions. The lighting at times looks flat and unappealing, but other times it looks damn good, creating these really striking scenes of contrast, like where the silhouette of an enemy creeps through a doorway. Even the qualities of your light source are reflected, with torches and fire creating a softer, flickering light, while magical light spells create an unnatural, pale, ghostly aura. The environments remind me a bit of the Elder Scrolls Oblivion-style texture work, where everything is just giga normal mapped for no other reason than to show off the fact that they could do it. And I'm not kidding when I say I love that shit. It's similar in Monomyth. All the stone walls and brick floors have a really noticeable interaction with light, like everything is sort of glistening with a thin layer of moisture. What can I say? I'm a certified moisture respecter, and Monomyth does it well. As far as animations and effects go, yeah, there's jank. There's plenty of jank. Maybe not as much jank as you might expect, but this is an early access pseudo-open world RPG with simulated physics being made by a solo developer. So yeah, there's jank.
I'll tear your eyes out. I'll tear your eyes out.
It's also a European game, so that's double jank. I'm sorry, that was low-hanging fruit. Look, Eurojank is a term of endearment that I think ought to be worn with pride. And it could be a lot worse. Central Europe has ambitious and experimental RPGs whose thematic bleakness is sometimes undercut by moments of jank-induced hilarity. France has rudeness, Alberta has alcoholism. Just as the European produces charmingly janky RPGs, so too does the Albertan drink 16 light beers and then wake up after 4 hours of poor quality sleep to punch in at their construction job. Cultural touchstones all, some less shameful than others. And you have to respect the developer whose RPG is designed with all these emergent game systems that make jank an inevitability. It's a lot like showing your ass to the world. You're inviting some degree of unintended levity into this very serious project you've poured blood, sweat, and tears into for years. I'm not even trying to be cheeky. Modern game developers rarely opt for modularity in design. It's always a very controlled experience to make sure the player never has unintended fun. So yeah, Monomyth has some jank. Sometimes that affects the experience negatively, like getting stuck in the environment or having NPCs react to your actions in unintended or undesirable ways. But most of the time it only adds to the experience and makes you want to test the waters. You want to see how the game's rules might be broken, because it's designed to have its rules broken. That's the glory of gameplay that's designed to be fun and systems driven as opposed to airtight. That's the glory of Eurojank. And in spite of this, Monomyth is solid in its construction, doing a good job of immersing the player with only occasional moments of accidental absurdity. On the topic of immersion, the audio design here is shaping up very nicely. There's a lot of restraint in the use of music. The battle themes are a bit heavy-handed, but in open-ended environments like this, there needs to be some sort of tell that you're in combat. Otherwise, you just suddenly start taking damage with no idea what's going on, so I can understand the necessity. Much of your time, though, is spent in these quiet, moody environments, accompanied mostly by diegetic sound effects and ambient soundscapes. It's tasteful. These are the sorts of things that quickly draw you back in, resetting your immersion after something funny happens. The game relies heavily on ambient music, where it blends together with the sounds of dripping water from pipes or the distant screeching of wildlife. It's very non-invasive, which is good because you'll be relying on directional audio at times. There's also a very Fromsoft musical sting that plays when you enter a new area, acting as a subtle signal that you're heading in the right direction. In some areas, like the Heartlands, there's no clear delineation between dungeons and non-hostile areas, like the church. Zones kind of bleed into each other, creating a seamless environment. In other cases, it's clear that you're in a dungeon, and the dungeons of Monomyth are the highlight. They're some of the dungeoniest dungeons I've ever seen in a game. They really capture that feeling of, oh, I'm embarking on an epic journey, I best be prepared, when you check your map and realize just how gargantuan the dungeon is. There aren't too many of these dungeons at present, but those that are here are already worth the game's asking price in my estimation. The mine in particular is pretty spectacular. Though the game does evoke oblivion in its ambience, the dungeon design is where the games part ways. Namely, the fact that Monomyth's dungeons don't suck ass. The mine is a sprawling, multi-leveled complex full of ancient technology that must be tinkered with to unlock its many secrets. Very little is explicitly told to the player, forcing you to rely on your perception, thoroughness, and critical thinking skills in order to overcome. The catacombs pose similar challenges, allowing you to explore at your own pace without quest markers, using your pattern recognition to deal with obstacles. Then there's the sewers, which are full of humanoid lizard enemies which can mess you up pretty quickly. When they see you, they'll screech, which not only paralyzes your character in fear, but rallies other nearby enemies to your location. So you're encouraged to sneak around, giving this whole area an Amnesia the Dark Descent kind of flavor. But the sewers are also full of quest-important goals and items, meaning you'll be sneaking back and forth often. So it might be worth getting crafty with explosives and magic just for that peace of mind. The sewers are a nice example of how Monomyth uses its gameplay framework to present the player with unique challenges. Sewer dungeons, as a rule, blow, but this one actually sticks the landing just because it's so different from anything else in the game. Monomyth doesn't reinvent the wheel. Its grid-based inventory system, rune-based magic system, and immersive sim design philosophies are all pulled from its inspirations. And if you've played those games, then their influence is very apparent. Yet, there's something about a modern Western RPG that embraces all of these traditional elements and combines them into something fresh that just puts a smile on my face. Monomyth is ambitious, but it also knows what it wants to be and doesn't reach beyond its own means. Solving puzzles, finding keys, battling fearsome enemies, and exploring a grim fantasy world. All such compelling reasons to play video games that they have been at the core of it since the 1970s. Monomyth embraces that and respects it, but also refines it. This is the kind of game that forces you to commit to your build and that has you constantly reassessing your need to top up your resources. It isn't afraid to throw a challenge at you that you very well may not be able to overcome. And I like that a lot. The only reason I'd be reticent to recommend Monomyth to everybody right now is because it's in early access. As much as I've talked it up, its unfinishedness is evident. It's full of enough small glitches and minor issues that it's not really worth bringing them up individually, any more than you'd point to individual mosquitoes on a camping trip. It just rained, it's the middle of summer, yeah, there's gonna be mosquitoes. You don't need to make an announcement every time you see one. But if you love camping, then no bug is gonna keep you from enjoying yourself, and Monomyth is the same. All that to say, I have no guarantee that Rat Tower will continue along the same trajectory. But if it does, and I'm reasonably confident that it will, then Monomyth is going to be a modern cult classic. Anybody who can spend a decade working on the same project, quitting their job, and completely changing their life in pursuit of this dream of finishing a game certainly has the stuff. At $20 American and with about 15 to 20 hours of gameplay, more if you're thorough, and with certainly some degree of replayability, Monomyth is already pretty good value, and I reckon it'll only get better. If you're a fan of Ultima Underworld, Thief, Dark Messiah, or any of the other games I mentioned, it's well worth a look. Gameplay-wise, it's quite a far cry from Kingsfield. This is much more simulation-focused, with way more room for experimentation and wacky gameplay situations. But atmospherically and aesthetically, there's certainly some parallels to be drawn here. If you find yourself drawn to the gray skies and damp tombs of Helidon, Monomyth does more than an adequate job of capturing that magic. The influence behind Verho, Curse of Faces, is obvious from the very beginning. It even has the sex compass. The game is still under active development with a playable demo out on Steam, but this one is so Kingsfield-y that I'd be remiss not to include it. This is the work of a sole developer that goes by Psyking, under the banner of Kasur Games. I got an email from Psyking last year letting me know that he was so taken with my Kingsfield video that it inspired him to start work on a Kings-like game of his own. Now, I have to admit, I was somewhat skeptical. Anybody who'd be inspired by my goofy ass couldn't possibly be a serious person doing a serious thing. But to my surprise, Verho was already coming along quite nicely. I figured this one was worth keeping an eye on. It's been the better part of a year since I was first acquainted with Verho, and what better time to jump back in and see how things have been chugging along than this, a celebration of Kingsfield and Shadow Tower inspired games. I forgot to mention one major criteria shared by many Kings-likes. They often have a somber voiceover intro where the passing of a great era is lamented, followed by an explanation for why things are shitty.
Humankind became desperate.
The people of Ariath retreat to the underground.
On that day, anyone who met another human being perished.
Brightly does the fire of light burn within your heart, Austin Lyle Forrester.
By no means do Kingsfield or Dark Souls have a monopoly on this sort of thing, but it is a very From core way of setting up a plot. If you're not depressed by the time you reach character creation, is it really a Kings-like? In Verho, we're told of an apocalyptic event which occurred many centuries ago. Without explanation, any human in the presence of another suddenly died. It was discovered by someone referred to as the Maker that the deaths weren't caused by the presence of others, but by two people seeing each other's faces. This led to a society wherein all people must wear masks in order to function. In search of answers, our protagonist, like many before him, travels to the mysterious land of Yariv, where the secrets of the calamity are said to be kept. On this journey, you create your character by selecting from a preset list of classes. Combat-centric classes tend to have abysmal magic skills and vice versa, which, once again, is good. I like consequences and I like having to commit to a build. Plus, you can respec if you really screw things up. In this land of Yariv, you'll find forlorn acquaintances on journeys of their own, but for the most part, this is a solitary experience. It's that kind of lonely, apocalyptic atmosphere that I was immediately taken with. The ambient soundscapes and muted palette capture that feeling of wandering around in a dead world. The level design here has more in common with Dark Souls than most Kingsfield games. There are shrines to the Maker, which serve as the game's bonfires, marking a checkpoint and allowing you to level up or fast travel to other shrines. Yariv opens up quickly, giving you access to several new areas, some of which you will almost certainly not be prepared for, but getting your ass handed to you is kind of part of the fun. The game does a great job of moving you through the intended progression route while still maintaining that feeling of openness via optional exploration. You don't feel led by the hand, but it rarely feels so Byzantine as to cause frustration. For example, in the starting area, you can initially only travel down one path. Looping around and climbing up to a cliff top, you can lower a ladder which gives you a shortcut. On that very cliff, you'll find a pitch-black cave which can be dealt with now, but you may be better off waiting for a light spell or a torch. Only by the time you find a torch, you'll have so many different paths to explore that you may have forgotten about the cave. Through shortcuts and branching paths, the game is very efficient in its reuse of the same environments, at least in these early stages. Your central hub zone is referred to as the Unnamed Village. It's here where you'll find friendly NPCs that can sell you spells or consumables. There's also a giant snake blacksmith, which is just unabashedly peak character design. As far as buying things goes, the economy is a little wonky. Containers respawn on death or reload, so you can just get tons and tons of gold and load up on items like crossbow bolts or health vials. Just by exploring, you'll also find a ridiculous amount of status buff items, which I kind of forgot about most of the time. I think some of this stuff should have been more prohibitively expensive. To the game's credit, the shop only carries a limited supply of items in an attempt to balance things, but I still found myself with tons of stuff by the end. There's a good variety of weapons available at present. Like some of the other games we've talked about, there's no armor here, just weapons, shields, and rings. In this case, the rings provide more passive bonuses while spells are found or purchased separately. The variety is high enough that the game doesn't suffer from a lack of loot like Eternal Ring does. For a solo developer, focusing on a single paradigm like weapons makes the most sense. It's better to have one aspect of the game work well than to have a whole bunch of half-assed, imbalanced elements working against each other. It's tough to make every build equally challenging and viable when you've got light armor and heavy armor to deal with on top of everything else. As mentioned, most of the initial character archetypes you choose from are specialized in one area. If you want to make the most of the game systems, you really have to commit to your build. On level up, you gain 3 skill points, which may give you the sense that being a jack of all trades is the best way to go, but that's not true in my experience. I mean, you can split the difference, but some of the best weapons require very high strength or dexterity scores, and the same goes for magic with intelligence. So if you're an indecisive person, you may end up with some less exciting weapons and lackluster spells. It'll get you by, but you'll be missing out on some cool shit, like the Moonblade, which is a reference to the Moonlight Sword from the Fromsoft classic 3D dot game heroes. For the Giga-Chad lunkheads among us, there's also a Lightning Zweihander, which puts a smile on my face. As a matter of fact, I seem to recall another Lightning Zweihander that once elicited such a smile.
For one thing, there's a Lightning Zweihander in this game. It's like the developers asked themselves, what would Modular want us to do here? A question I wish more devs were willing to ask. Actually, they don't need to. Just put a Lightning Zweihander in your game.
An inscription is carved into it, perhaps the name of a blacksmith or the original owner. Unfortunately, most of the text has been worn away with only one part still legible. Maju. It's me. I'm the architect of my own delight. I don't say this lightly, but Verho is the greatest game ever made. Now don't get too excited, some of these weapons aren't available in the public demo. Psyking generously allowed me to try a demo he put together for Gamescom, so some of the things you're seeing here will only be available in the full game. The demo still has its fair share of nifty swag, like the Ice Mace and a Greatsword, which is remarkably sensible given the propensity for gigantic anime swords. Leveling up evens the odds, but the enemies do pose a legitimate threat, some more than others. Combat works more or less as expected here. You can attack by rapidly pressing the swing button, but you're way better off holding it down, waiting till the bar fills, and then going in for that big hit. You can also use a shield in your offhand, which lets you absorb hits, but it slows you down so much that I never found it too useful. Plus, it takes up a huge portion of the screen, though the game was patched to allow for weapon sheathing. Anyway, you're better off dodging enemies when possible, either by moving out of the way or hopping around. On that note, you can jump in this game. Like Mouselook, jumping itself really changes the dynamic between the player and their enemies. That's a whole additional axis to consider when designing environments and movesets, but Verho does compensate for this quite effectively. There's only a small handful of enemy types per area, but each one feels distinct with unpredictable behaviors, at least at first. They can lunge at you, summon assistants to put you on the back foot, and many of the enemies have projectile attacks, which makes it harder to cheese them. Harder, but not altogether impossible. What's nice about the enemy attacks is that they're all telegraphed well. There's always a visual or audio cue before a particular attack takes place, so with repeated exposure to the enemies, you become comfortable with their movesets. Even some of the more traditionally annoying enemies are designed in clever ways. The bats, for instance, leave behind a trail of particles so you can track them as they fly away rather than standing there wondering what hit you. The game is slow-paced, but enemies can hit hard and move quick, so it's important to not lose control of a situation. The story of the game is, unsurprisingly, told in that familiar Fromsoft style. You're sort of a feeble, cursed one walking around a dead world, surrounded by depressed people who sit like this and say things like, "Still alive, eh? Didn't think you had it in you. Well, there's nothing left anyway. This city ain't worth the cursed soil it's built atop. But you've still got that light in your eyes. Maybe you have a chance. As for me, well, you didn't equip the green rosary beads from behind the sinner's grave while fighting Zanzibar, so my questline is over." Okay, well, it's not exactly like that, but you know what I mean. By the time the demo has ended, you're still very much in the dark in regard to the nature of Verho and the cause of the calamity. There certainly is some setup for future exploration of the Maker, and it seems that all roads point to the capital city of Verho, which I'm interested in exploring. I think the mask motif also has a lot of potential for some thematic undertones, or overtones as it were. But the actual substantive plot in the demo is pretty minimal, mostly told environmentally and through cryptic ramblings. And that's a dangerous game. It's hard to make cryptic ramblings interesting. From Software make it look deceptively easy because they're really good at it. But the war for a player's attention is a hard-fought one, and it's never a given that people will already care about your world going into it. Lunacid kicks off with a beautifully directed intro that establishes the mythology baked into its eldritch world. By the time you're dropped off in the game, you're already curious about the well. Verho doesn't yet have that hook. The central events of the story feel distant, and none of the characters in the village are endearing enough to make me emotionally invested in their lives. With some of the monologuing, they feel more like vessels to deliver lore or gameplay instructions than people. Despite the fact that his name is literally the gameplay mechanic that he serves, Stockpile Thomas from Demon's Souls is a dude who's worth caring about, and that's established pretty quickly. He's warm and endearing, he's eager to help, and he's also perennially haunted by the events of the story in a way that connects you to both him and those events. I long for some of those types of connections with the characters of Verho. I'd love to have the nameless village feel like an oasis that I actively want to return to for more reasons than just upgrading my weapons. It's entirely possible that these characters will undergo revisions before the game is done, and even though the story hasn't grabbed me, the game's atmosphere is great at pulling you in. Entering the morning forest for the first time with its eerie fog and gravestones and seeing this massive prison towering in the distance is such a good moment. Entering the old temple quarters and having all these skittering eyes on the walls staring at you is a memorable and unsettling visual too. You're just waiting for something bad to happen as you skulk around, then unearthing the evils beneath the temple while this eerie music plays. Understated moments like these are what makes this genre so engaging. The music in general is also very good, beyond my expectations to be honest. It doesn't go for the upbeat variety of tracks you'd find in something like Lunacid or even the Kingsfield games. It's mostly very downcast, but appropriate. The Nameless Village music in particular is perfect. It nails that somber tone. I also love how the motif is later reused, such as in the swamp area. This one has a very nighttime Xenoblade Chronicles vibe, kinda sets it apart from any of the other games we've talked about. Like many a Kingsfield before it, Verho's visuals go for a low-poly PS1-like style. The 3D models are all very rectangular and flat-shaded. It's disguised well with the retro filter, which is activated by default, and so I assume the intended way to play the game. Without it, everything looks much sharper, but I think it reveals too many details and breaks that retro illusion. The way the specular lighting works kind of makes everything look like it's made of smooth plastic too, which I'm not a huge fan of. It seems like there's also some kind of glow effect or chromatic aberration shader being applied which interacts with the retro filter in a weird way. Kind of makes the screen look like it's covered in a mosaic filter at times rather than an actual lower internal resolution. You get fuzzy edges on stuff in the environment and some of the particle effects don't blend very well with it. The game definitely looks best in low-light environments. That's where the classic art style and modern rendering techniques meld together best. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a demo of a game that isn't finished yet, so I could nitpick things like this all day. On that note, I hope that this game includes plenty of secrets when it's finally released. It seemed like the game was almost eager to give away some of its more interesting gear. Sometimes I want to work for it. Not like Lunacid work for it, but you know, it's kind of a happy medium there. Nonetheless, for a free demo, this is pretty huge. It's like 5 hours long. There's lots of environments to explore, unique enemies to fight, and weapons to find. Map design is solid with branching pathways, the designs and visual effects are charming, and there are some really great moments of exploration to be had here. It has its issues, but if Kasur Games is confident enough to give this much away for free, then I'd say that bodes very well for the future. Much like Monomyth, I think Verho is on a solid trajectory. It's being worked on by a person who's likely to realize their vision, which, again, is rare. You need a certain set of qualities to make a game like this. You need ambition and outrageous work ethic, but you also need to be realistic and understand how to compartmentalize your big ideas before they explode and kill you. You need to have confidence, but also enough humility that you can withstand people on the Steam forums telling you that you're a hack every day. I kid to an extent, but honestly, not everybody has the constitution to spend every waking hour on their passion project, then smile, look Barfy Man 362 in the eyes, and say, "Thanks for your feedback, I'll take it under consideration," when he suggests that your Kings-like have drivable Dodge Challengers and gun customization. Probably should have picked a better example, that sounds awesome. I can't complain, I had 5 enjoyable hours with Verho and I didn't pay a penny. Someday, hopefully, I will. Verho gets a thumbs up. Give the demo a try and give it a wishlist if you're so inclined. That's a big help for small developers. I'm gonna take you back to the past to play a nifty game that kicks ass, at least insofar as I can actually play it, since the entire game is in Japanese. Hungry Ghosts is a weird-ass game, and at this point, I'm playing pretty fast and loose with the definition of Kings-like. While perhaps only tangentially related, I'm seizing the opportunity to talk about this game. Hungry Ghosts was released exclusively in Japan on the PS2 back in 2003. It's had no English translations, fan or otherwise. One is supposedly in the works, although progress updates have been sparse for some time, so we are left relying on a combination of intuition, which is unreliable, and Google Translate, which is unreliable. The game was developed by Deep Space Incorporated, whose only other release was a survival horror game called Extermination, also on the PS2. That game actually did escape Japan, so it's possible that you, unlike me, have heard of that one. It was a very early PS2 game, a fairly unremarkable one it seems, but it's worth noting that both Extermination and Hungry Ghosts were directed by Tokuro Fujiwara. Fujiwara is actually something of an industry legend, having been creatively involved with some major series over the years. In his early career, he directed games like Ghosts and Goblins and the cult classic RPG Sweet Home. The latter would act as inspiration for Resident Evil, also co-created and produced by Fujiwara, though directed by Shinji Mikami. One could say that unconventional horror games are very much in the man's wheelhouse, and Hungry Ghosts is no different in that regard. Now that is a Kino new game transition. After signing a contract with your name, you're given control of your player character, with no choice but to climb into an ominous boat on a dark and foggy evening. At the bow appears none other than death itself. It seems that you've died, and you mustn't have been a particularly good person, because you're going to hell, along with countless other restless spirits. The good news is that you alone hold the key to your ultimate destiny. Through the choices you make and the growth that you exhibit, you may yet have a chance for redemption, for your judgment is not final. How this plays out in game is really fascinating. Hungry Ghosts is mostly a puzzle game with some light action elements. You'll enter different zones which are largely self-contained. From there, you'll be given information regarding specific accounts, tormented beings who, either through their own actions or those of others, were left with their souls hanging in the balance. It's not clear that every spirit here deserves redemption. Just as often as a ghost may earnestly need your guidance, another may lie to your face, laugh at you, and attempt to cause you suffering as they did with countless others in life. Spectral diplomacy isn't always an option, sometimes conflict is unavoidable. In situations like this, you pull out your trusty spear or crossbow and deal with the situation the only way you know how, by using an incredibly awkward control scheme to circle strafe around enemies and hope that they die before you do. I told you it was Kingsfield related. The unconventional nature of Hungry Ghost's gameplay is evident from the tutorial area. Every time you examine anything, from a barrel to an item to a door to an NPC, you're given a warning before you act. It says something to the tune of, "Which choice will you make? Choose carefully, it could affect your fate." These are strange words to reflect on when you're doing something as benign as picking up a consumable healing item or opening up a door to the next area. Even weirder is the fact that the player has to manually extend their arm forward with the right stick to interact with said object. Between that warning and the framing of these shots where you have to slowly move your arm to pick something up, there's a lot of tension in something as harmless as grabbing an item. But sometimes the paranoia is justified. I've never seen a basic interaction system quite like this. Spirits can show up to harm you, forcing you to snap the right stick back to avoid damage, mirroring the physicality of retracting your arm in surprise. And just the mere act of taking an item can have consequences. Sometimes you're posed a choice between two different items. They might each be useful in their own ways, but it can be more complicated than that. One item might be critical in helping to understand a particular spirit's conundrum, while the other may have an obvious practical benefit. You might follow your gamer instinct and pick the less appealing choice, thinking it could have something to do with the progression of a task, but that might not be the case. You very well may have just screwed yourself out of a great item for no reason other than the promise of later reward, which is kind of a sin in itself. Sometimes the best thing to do is to leave items be, just not touch anything. Forcing the dead to relinquish their treasure by stabbing them may demonstrate your violent side. Breaking pots and barrels wantonly for items could be proof of a destructive spirit. From the larger choices you make to the micro choices made in gameplay, everything you do reflects on the totality of who you are. This in turn affects your ability to ease the suffering of others and may plunge you deeper and deeper into a hell of your own creation. If it sounds like I'm being cryptic, I just literally don't know the extent to which any given action affects the course of things, and that's kind of the point. Glancing at the closest thing to a walkthrough there is online, I can tell you that I made some unintentionally dreadful choices, and my game certainly reflected it. Yet Hungry Ghosts is very careful to not ever say you've made the wrong choice, simply that you've made a choice, and this is something you'll have to get used to. Even not making a choice is a choice in itself here. This is what makes Hungry Ghosts such an enduringly unique game. A major stumbling block in the way video games implement choice and consequence is the obviousness with which choices are typically presented. Things like optional quests or dialogue options that'll have far-reaching effects. Sometimes specific attention is even called to these choices, so you never have to wonder what might affect your game and what won't. If the purpose of choice in a game is to invest the player by challenging their morality or intuition and forcing them to lie in the bed that they've made, then having the choices presented in this way is a clumsy solution. If someone is spending 100 hours playing a game, they'll naturally want to pursue the win condition. Getting the bad ending in a game like The Witcher 3 is devastating. In this case, they may not want to choose what they think is right, but what they perceive as the choice the game wants them to make, perhaps going so far as to look up the outcome online and spoil things for themselves just to avoid those consequences. This can be compensated for by adding unintended repercussions to choices or having outcomes be morally ambiguous, but the problem still remains. Choice systems in most games are rigid and inflexible. I always thought Silent Hill 2 had an interesting take on player choice. Without spoiling anything story-related, subtle actions such as how you use healing items or the frequency with which you interact with particular key objects will affect the fate of certain characters. There's still an obvious problem, which is that once the player is aware of those variables, they might choose to play a certain way in order to get their desired ending. But the concept of a parallel choice system where outcomes are affected in unanticipated ways is a blue ocean of potential for games where choices matter. This is where Hungry Ghosts becomes a really exciting game for me. The game has a large number of enigmatic conditions which affect scenes and outcomes. To put it bluntly, I don't know what the fuck is going on. Part of that is undoubtedly the fact that I don't speak Japanese, and I'm relying on a very basic translation to help me along. But there's more to it than that. Much like in Silent Hill 2, there are subtle, seemingly innocuous interactions you'll have with the game world that'll cause you to shift story branches without your knowledge. This is interesting because even though you may not end up with your desired outcome, you never feel like you're being shafted. The number of potential interactions that can lead to a particular result is so massive that analyzing these defining choose-your-own-adventure moments is impossible. Rather than being the result of one decision, your situation and the ending you get is the sum of them. Playing optimally and asking yourself, well, what does the game want me to do here? Becomes impractical, which is awesome, because it forces you to play the game, staying on your best behavior as you realize that everything you do kind of matters. It's easy to say, I won't take any healing items because I don't want the game to think that I'm greedy. But it's another matter altogether when you're nearly dead after a tough boss fight. You'd do anything for an apple. In that way, it's actually a clever reflection of the kinds of morality that's damned these souls in the first place. It's easy to be good when things are good, but when your back is against the wall, transcending that base desire for security and comfort becomes harder and harder. It's at this point where justification may creep in. Well, I've helped so many people in the game that if I stab this one guy and take his stuff, I probably won't be punished for it. The ability to strike a balance and regulate oneself in these situations may be the difference between heaven or hell. That sort of decision-making is a powerful motivator for the player in Hungry Ghosts. On top of these story choices, some gameplay decisions have immediate and obvious effects too. If you love smashing things, you may want to temper that here and there, or else you could break a barrel full of oil next to a campfire and render a passage inaccessible. Maybe you're later given the choice between a water skin and a shiny golden key. The key is obviously more tempting, but tossing the water skin at the fire can undo what's been done, at a cost, always at a cost. Consumable items which serve a predictable purpose can be used in unexpected ways to open up new avenues or deal with sticky situations. The obvious use of apples is to restore your character's health, but you may be able to feed some hungry prisoners if you save a few. Do they even deserve to eat? Who's to say? Just don't give them any of the stanky fruit. Ghosts hate the stanky fruit. There are a lot of little environmental interactions like this that introduce new concepts into the game. So much of the environment itself can be examined for further details or sometimes hidden items. The dead can be spoken to, their bodies examined for clues. Trees, ornaments, scratchings on a wall, you're given the sense that nearly everything in Hungry Ghosts has a significance to it, and that's accentuated by the game's visual style. This is a gorgeous game, especially for 2003. The level of detail here is superb, with every model and texture having love poured into it. The environments aren't huge, but they're so packed with visual flourishes that it's almost worth playing Hungry Ghosts just to see and experience this world. The animation of the spirits is also very expressive, both in the friendly NPCs and the enemies. The older I get, the more I realize that 2003 to 2005 was like the peak of facial animation in video games. The sound design goes a long way in helping to facilitate the atmosphere here. There's a constant low-grade ambience playing throughout the entire game. It reminds me of Eric Brosius' work on the Thief series, just a thick aural component to the game's atmosphere. The hell of Hungry Ghosts feels big and empty. It just looks and sounds like hopelessness. Now, the enemy variety isn't huge, but their designs and animations are fantastic. There's a mythological component to the visual design here, such as the titular Hungry Ghosts. Among your enemies are the Preta, which literally translates to Hungry Ghosts. These ghosts are based on supernatural beings in Buddhism, the anguished spirits of those who lived evil and base lives. The Preta are eternally unsatisfied, unable to satiate the desires that drove them in life, and they certainly look anguished even when they're trying to attack you. I looked forward to screwing up and getting into fights with ghosts just to see what kind of impressive designs they might have. No matter how well you know the game, some conflicts seem unavoidable. That's why you show up to hell with a spear and a crossbow, and controlling these things is as weird as controlling everything else. As is the case in your King's Fields, strafing is controlled with the shoulder buttons. Strangely, in order to look around, you have to hold L1, which locks your character in place but enables a vertical look. Holding down R1 will lock your view horizontally but allow you to both move and look around faster. It's awkward, to be sure, especially since the look and move speed are both pretty slow. Combat is another matter. Like interacting with the environment, the right analog stick acts as an extension of your character's arms. Pushing it up in a quick motion will thrust your spear forward. Holding the stick back allows you to charge up your stab, signified by the little ding, at which point your thrust will be much more powerful. This is analogous to the King's Field stamina system, where simply mashing the attack button is the least efficient way of dealing damage. Instead, you have to manage your time and surroundings when dealing with enemies. Most of them are quite slow, but they often have special moves or projectile attacks. Learning and anticipating these behaviors will help keep you alive. Full disclosure, I can't make it far enough to test this, but it seems like there's some kind of weapon upgrade system where you can affix different shafts and spearheads together. You also have your crossbow, which is controlled in a similar way. Pull back on the stick to arm it, then release to send a bolt flying forward. There are different kinds of bolts, and they're limited. There are occasionally puzzles or environmental interactions that require ranged attacks, so it's never a good idea to be walking around with an empty quiver. There are special items which can be used in combat. Certain kinds of rotting fruit will stun enemies, for instance. If you throw a potato at ghosts, they'll just start chilling. Various attacks that would otherwise curse your character can be nullified if you're carrying a curse-resistant doll. There is more to it than simply stabbing and strafing, and resource management plays a big part in how easy some of these encounters can be. You have two separate life bars, Spirit and Vitality. Spirit represents your mental strength, while Vitality is your health proper. Once Vitality is at 0, you're dead, but Spirit is important too. If you run out of spirit points, you can no longer charge your spear for an attack, which is a huge disadvantage, especially if you're in the middle of a boss fight. Your max spirit is raised as you defeat bosses and move forward through the game, but both bars are always one encounter away from potentially being drained, so you'll want to keep plenty of apples on standby to keep everything maxed out. The whole thing isn't a Kings-like so much as it's an early Fromsoft-like. There's a little bit of King's Field, a bit of Echo Knight, a bit of Shadow Tower, a bit of Kuon. Perhaps not literally, but it all bears a resemblance to that outsider art ethos that early From games hit on so regularly. Much like early From games, the act of playing Hungry Ghosts is as engrossing as it is frustrating. Design elements you might take as obvious are rejected in favor of something original. For example, in most games, picking up an item is a matter of looking at it and pressing the interact button, maybe answering yes or no in a dialog box. In Hungry Ghosts, not only items, but every interaction sends you to a separate screen where you're given a final option to walk away before interacting with the object. Proceeding, you have to manually extend your character's hand forward to pick up an item or open a door. As I've mentioned, this gives a constant sense of weight to seemingly minor decisions, which is interesting precisely because it's not something I've ever seen in a video game. The reason it's not something I've ever seen in a video game is because it gets pretty damn annoying to go through this every time you want to do anything. A huge percentage of the runtime is spent staring at things with the intention of interacting with them, which really does a number on the game's pacing. The movement and combat also leave me with mixed feelings. On one hand, I really like the idea of this more tangible control system, and that's all well and good, but the awkwardness of movement and even the simple act of looking around becomes a drag. When you're fighting a difficult boss in a tiny arena, the disconnected control scheme is a curse in itself. L1 to look around, R1 to speed up, hold the right stick back to keep an attack charged, use L2 and R2 to strafe. I understand that part of the difficulty is dealing with these controls. It's a similar philosophy that Fujiwara and co. practiced with Resident Evil's tank controls. But tank controls, while certainly deliberate and part of a game's challenge, become intuitive as you play the game. Hungry Ghosts controls were just too awkward for me to ever reliably develop muscle memory. I found myself annoyed when I was in a room with lots of items and notes simply because I dreaded all of the looking around that was sure to follow. Hungry Ghosts is a game that marches to the beat of its own drum in almost every regard, stepping outside of the box in even the most basic ways. From decision-making to dialogue to breaking barrels, note collecting, morality, combat, healing, name entry, treasure chests, every established game trope you find here has been turned on its head in some way, and I have a hell of a lot of respect for that. Hungry Ghosts really had no chance of becoming a mainstream success even in its own country, much less abroad, and I appreciate that it was made in spite of that. It's as fascinating as it is clunky, and considering its experimental nature, the fact that it sticks the landing as often as it does is worthy of praise. Fujiwara could have easily fired out a Resident Evil clone. I mean, he produced the damn thing, so if anyone deserved to make a Resident Evil clone, it'd be him. But much like that original Resident Evil and Sweet Home before it, he chose to take the path less traveled, challenging conventions and innovating in an industry that's often happy to rest on its laurels. It may have died a quieter death than Resident Evil, but as was the case with Kingsfield, hindsight has been exceptionally kind to Hungry Ghosts and all of the things that it does different. It's well worth another look today. Here's hoping it gets an English fan translation so we can get a better idea of what we missed back in 2003. In the world of games inspired by Kingsfield, and especially by Shadow Tower, an element of horror is almost inevitable. There's a nightmarish undercurrent in these destroyed worlds inhabited by bizarre monsters and haunted by the spirits of the dead. As you creep around the decrepit halls of castles and barracks long abandoned, down to your last healing items and an hour out from your last save point, you can't help but ask yourself, what could possibly be next? Of all the projects we've talked about today, no game leans into that horror and dread quite like Labyrinth of the Demon King. Developed by one J.R. Hudipole, Labyrinth of the Demon King exists at the crossroads of Kingsfield and Silent Hill and a whole bunch of others, while also managing to step out of all of those long shadows. Labyrinth takes place in a parallel version of feudal Japan during the latter age of the Dharma, a time of greed, suffering, and moral decay. Literal demons have manifested in the wake of this darkness, with one such demon leading our protagonist's lord to his death. Playing as an Ashigaru, an infantryman of Clan Takeda, it's our job to hunt this demon down in his castle and exact revenge for the death of our lord. You begin your journey in a gray, foggy forest. Eventually you'll find a cave and have no choice but to enter. Deeper and deeper into the abyss, you wonder if there's any end to the darkness, or if you'll be here forever. Then, at its deepest point, a lifeline, a rope with which you ascend to the world above, like a spider's thread dangled into the bowels of hell. No darkness can reach you up here, just the gray light of day and the familiar sound of rain. Yet the dread lingers, like the morning after a nightmare. If such crushing darkness exists, then perhaps yours is to confront it again. This intro sequence makes a very strong first impression. It's a slow burn in which the fear gradually intensifies. Rather than immediately being thrust into the horror or opening up with a non-interactive cutscene, you're given full control over your descent into darkness. It evokes a strong feeling of anticipatory fear, followed by relief when you're back outdoors. In short order, you find a rusty katana and enter the Demon King's castle proper, and it's here where the game really begins. In terms of its broad structure, Labyrinth has a lot in common with Silent Hill. You enter a new zone full of enemies, resources, locked doors, and puzzles. Through exploration and combat, you gradually uncover the area's secrets before completing it and moving on to the next. With each new area, you'll have to find a map ASAP. It's easy enough to be turned around in the murky halls of the castle even when you do have one. The good news is that you're not alone in the castle. The bad news is that you're not alone in the castle. These different zones are full of unique enemies that can very quickly show you what for if you aren't prepared for them. Thankfully, there's a nice variety of weapons and even rudimentary spells that you can use in self-defense, but that doesn't make the game easy. Far from it. Labyrinth is a tough game that shows you no quarter, especially in the beginning. It also nails the slowness of Kingsfield's combat in a way that no other game I've played has. As I mentioned earlier, once you introduce modern control schemes, namely mouse look, into the equation, a major piece of the Kingsfield or Shadow Tower formula crumbles away, not to imply that games like Labyrinth were built with the intent of emulating it at all, but still, it adds a big asterisk in every comparison drawn to those games. When you can turn around at a moment's notice or jump to avoid an enemy, combat becomes inherently more action-focused. Not necessarily less difficult, but almost always less tense. Labyrinth manages to compensate for this in a number of really smart ways. Dodging and attacking are lengthy commitments which rely on a stamina bar, one that drains rapidly and fills slowly. If that stamina bar reaches 0, you're in big trouble. This is where emergency consumable healing and stamina recovery items come in handy, but you can only carry 5 of each, and that doesn't go a long way in the beginning. So you're incentivized to be very smart about how stamina is used on a per enemy basis. Rarely is straightforwardly mashing the attack button a good idea. Your foes are capable of blocking you, throwing you off balance, and counterattacking. So instead, you might try breaking an enemy's defense with a kick and following up with an attack. If you can buy the time, charging up a strong attack is almost guaranteed to break an enemy's guard, but it also uses up so much stamina that you might not be able to take advantage of the opening. Quick dodging is great, but you can only do it once every 5 seconds or else it costs a ton of stamina. Sometimes you'll just have to block to soak up minimal damage or turn tail and run away, hope that you're not being stalked through the halls. Sprinting doesn't drain your stamina, but it also prevents stamina recovery, leaving you in a coward's limbo, as it were. There are also consumable magic talismans which can do as little as stagger enemies, or as much as banish them from this mortal coil. In any case, the absolute worst thing you can do is panic. There's a very intentional feeling of clumsiness in the game's combat. If you don't keep a mental cue of your actions and surroundings, things will rapidly spiral out of your control. Even when ganged up on by enemies, you have to relax, think clearly, and carry out your actions concisely, making sure that your stamina doesn't deplete. Even having 1 stamina point left can be the difference between life or death. Keeping a cool head is easier said than done, as encounters with multiple enemies are often lethal, draining your hard-fought resources. This is especially true in the beginning of the game when you don't have any experience with the combat system and only a rusty piece of shit katana to your name. In forcing you to keep your head, literally, not only does Labyrinth manage to pull the throttle back on combat pacing, but it also elevates the horror. It's notoriously difficult to strike that perfect horror game balance, allowing the player to defend themselves effectively while also keeping stress levels high. Yet, Labyrinth does a really impressive job of walking that tightrope. It's not perfect. Sometimes enemy behavior is dumb enough to take you out of the experience, or even to create unexpected alliances. You go your way, I'll go mine. Little pieces of clutter and furniture can stop you and your enemies dead in your tracks. Your character also staggers when hit, even if it's just a tiny bug nibbling your big toe, so if you have the misfortune of meeting a bunch of little insects, trying to get the stomp animation to trigger becomes an exercise in frustration more than fair challenge. But all things considered, the slow-paced combat is clunky in mostly the right ways. You feel yourself getting better at it, but never so much that any strategy feels exploitable. Cutting down enemies is both intense and rewarding. If your ass is handed to you, there's almost certainly something you could have done differently. If you've got a group of enemies on you, sometimes you can goad them into hitting each other, which is a lifesaver at times. Limiting consumables to just 5 each and 2 for higher quality items was also definitely the right move. It tends to either be feast or famine in Labyrinth, so if you just had limitless inventory space, you'd probably have 100 bottles of sake by the time you reach the end. I mean, who the hell do you think you are, Yojimbo? You do have some allies in the fight against the endless yokai. You can spend your precious money with the Neko merchant who sells you consumables, equipment, and even upgrade materials. Those materials can be traded with the blacksmith. I love that little bastard. The Shuriko Dama you find can be used to temper your weapons, though there's a limited supply, so it's best to pick 1 or 2 weapons you really like and focus on those. Weapons have various damage, speed, and stamina usage ratings, with the heavier ones typically having a greater risk to reward ratio. They can also deal different damage types, either slash or blunt, so it's important to have the right weapon equipped depending on an enemy's weakness. So what is a Shuriko Dama anyway? Oh. To all of the restless spirits wandering this castle, I promise that with each swing of the blacksmith's hammer, your erstwhile plundered assholes shall be honored thusly. In the beginning of the game, you'll have a sword hilt, which can eventually be upgraded and turned into a blade of your choosing as you find more across the game. So you don't want to blow it and turn it into a rusty sword right in the beginning. You want to wait until you can turn it into the Masamune, a clear reference to the Moonlight Sword from FromSoftware's 3D Dot Game Heroes series. Now let's discuss an area where Labyrinth succeeds with aplomb. The horror. I consider my horror tolerance to be fairly average. Your Resident Evils, your Silent Hills, I can deal with them. Beating the baby part in Resident Evil 8 VR was a recent accomplishment of mine, and it damn near killed me. I wouldn't want to do anything scarier than that. With all that said, you can take my opinion with a grain of salt. But I found Labyrinth of the Demon King to be a legitimately dread-inducing game. I was very scared while playing it. After a break, I started working on my thumbnail, editing earlier sections of this video's script, doing all kinds of stuff that wasn't playing the game for this video. I realized that subconsciously I was putting it off because I was scared, like a baby. It starts with the game's visual aesthetic. It goes for that PS1 horror style. The models all resemble that which they're supposed to be, but the texture work is deliberately murky and ambiguous. Is that rust? Is it blood? Maybe neither. Everything is covered in a layer of grime, making for some very noisy looking visuals, down to the non-negotiable inclusion of a literal visual noise filter. The clarity is just high enough to reveal doorways or points of interest, but it's obscured by filth and shadows. If you're anything like me, you'll be tilting at windmills quite a bit in this game, and the darker it gets, the more windmills you see. Yeah, you have a torch, but you can only use it if you're not wielding a two-handed weapon, and look how helpful it is. Big whoop. In this regard, the enemy design is extremely effective. Nothing here feels gratuitous or shocking for the sake of it. Instead, the enemies you face are vaguely recognizable. They're anchored to something real, which in turn tickles the part of your brain that asks, "What is that thing?" which is just an intrinsically scary question. Even the otherwise banal enemies like skeletons, which I'm so accustomed to that I usually delight in their presence, are pretty terrifying when they emerge from the shadows. Now, I hate to be Mr. Filter Whiner, but I once again have to say I'm not a huge fan of the retro filter used to simulate low internal resolution here. It just looks off in a lot of circumstances, especially in scenes with lots of light. The pixels aren't very sharp, but rather sort of murky, making some frames look more like low-quality JPEGs or a late 2000s YouTube video with lots of compression rather than a retro game. On the topic of retro revival, the game is also displayed in 4:3, and I like that a lot. This will definitely be a matter of opinion, and as far as I'm aware, you can disable it now, but it's clearly the intended way to experience the game. On top of bringing the game visually closer to its PS1 inspirations, the smaller viewport serves a gameplay purpose too. With the edges of your screen cropped, your peripheral vision is severely impacted. This really heightens the feeling of claustrophobia in certain scenes, making it a mechanical choice as much as it is an artistic one. As a certified ultra-wide and high FOV enjoyer, I have to admit that there are times where horror games are negatively impacted by the extra real estate. I just like to know when a cyborg midwife is sneaking up to steal my Shuriko Dama. Oh no you don't, bitch. Having the game displayed in an old-school aspect ratio with a preset FOV allows the developers to create bespoke moments with the knowledge that every player is on equal visual footing. And there are some very effective scares here. Never anything cheap, mind you, but enemies waiting to ambush you around corners, or the appearance of certain monsters when you retrieve an item. I began to feel like the game was more in control of my emotions than I was, and I guess it's hard to think of higher praise for a horror game than that, even though I didn't like it at the time. There's also a great ebb and flow to the level design. Almost every area is spooky in its own unique way, but as you're being driven to the point of exhaustion with all the crushing darkness, the game relents, giving you a chance to catch your breath and drink some tea. But it only lets up a little. There are no Resident Evil safe rooms in the areas proper. Once you enter a section of the stronghold, you're committed to it. You can run out and recoup your spent resources, but there's only a handful of shortcuts, so you'll be trudging through large sections of the map to resume your progress. Not to mention that enemies will respawn at least semi-randomly, so clearing out a room or hallway is no guarantee that you'll be safe when you come back. Like I said, relentless. The level design is consistently good, relying mainly on puzzle solving to facilitate the exploration. For instance, you'll be forced to confront all the dark corners of a map in pursuit of bells which must be rung to summon the area's boss, or finding key items to open doors. Most of the puzzles are decent, though there was never anything I found brilliantly executed, and a few that were mostly just frustrating. In the bathhouse area, you can only drain water in certain sections at any given time based on the color of the valve that you turned most recently. Between the muted color palette and my color blindness, this was a pain in the ass, I will admit, but even beyond my personal foibles, the amount of walking back and forth from the control room to newly accessible areas did get tedious, much in the tradition of yesteryear's survival horror puzzles, I suppose. Still, the puzzles serve their purpose, which is getting you to explore and forcing the player to confront the game's unknown. Perhaps the most impressive thing about Labyrinth is its sound design. It's just stellar. First of all, the soundtrack composed by Reimu Daifuku really helps shoulder the game's mood. It seems to be inspired by Akira Yamaoka's work, not only on Silent Hill 2, which is typically and understandably where influence is usually pulled from, but also Silent Hill 1, which is refreshing. Well, not in like the Tropicana sense of the word, but you know what I mean. As often as scenes are awash with these soft, dreamy synths or gentle, classic Japanese instrumentation, they're juxtaposed with the murmuring, dark ambience and these industrial tracks that just rattle your brain. Metallic scraping and the pounding of drums like a washing machine off its axis. There's an extreme contrast between the game's sonic environments, which again really helps throw the player off balance. Suddenly you're up against a terrifying new enemy, there's a cacophony in your ears, and the whole situation just plunges into this new layer of discomfort. Much like the visuals, it's a great mix of traditional elements being used in haunting ways, blended with more modern sensibilities. Any piece of music that can begin with that yo sound effect and still scare the shit out of you deserves some props, and the soundtrack does indeed contain such a piece. Much of the time the music is limited to an amelodic ambience that just follows you around, and that strikes another great balance here. Let's look at the old Fromsoft extremes. On one hand, if you add music from a game like Kingsfield to Labyrinth, it's still atmospheric, but the edge is lost. It's adding too much color and suggesting too much about the world. If you strip away music altogether, a la Shadow Tower, you become too aware of your surroundings. You need a little something to obfuscate the environmental audio, to create an uncertainty of whether or not you just heard footsteps coming from another room. That sort of ambiguity creates doubt, and doubt creates fear. If you know someone's in your house, you just grab your golden desert eagles and deal with the problem. If you only think someone's in your house, well, that's a whole different kettle of fish. The soundscapes here are a critical piece of the horror, this constant feeling of uncertainty that just never lets up. The sound effects are similarly creepy. Most of the sounds, from impacts to the dialogue noises to the barks you'll hear from monsters, are covered with this bizarre digital distortion. It makes the creatures sound totally otherworldly and even kind of grating. Even when I know an enemy is present, hearing them from around the corner always makes my heart jump because of that sudden foray outside of the low rumbling you spend most of the time hearing. There's a minor gameplay spoiler I'll be talking about now. Nothing crazy, probably not that much of a spoiler considering it happens in the first hour of the game, but if you want to go in blind, go ahead and skip to this timestamp. Otherwise, I'm going to start talking about it now. Very early on, you'll be posed with your first real puzzle. In order to free the blacksmith, you have to pilfer a Buddha statue from a shrine. Never mind the note that says, if you take the Buddha statue, a spirit called Nuri Botake with dangly gross eyeballs will show up and kill you. We're just gonna take it. See? Everything's fine. Oh man, why do bad things happen to great people? Labyrinth has a pursuer enemy, and if you're like me, pursuer enemies are the scariest things ever. I'll admit it, I'm a coward when it comes to pursuer enemies. If you don't know what I'm talking about, certain horror games will have an enemy whose existence is solely dedicated to walking around and hunting you down, giving you a hard time. A hard time? What the f***? Like he's gonna give you a swirly if he picks you up. A bad time, how about that? So think Mr. X from Resident Evil 2 or Scissor Man from Clock Tower. As is the case in those games, you can slow the Nuri Botake down, but you can't kill it. At first I thought, I'm sure he only haunts the first floor. But then he done haunted the next floor. So then I thought, I'm sure he only haunts the first building. But then he done haunted the next building. So on and so forth. By the end of the game, I thought to myself, I'm sure he's just a video game character, he can't haunt me in real life, and I can't even tell you how scared I am to find out whether or not I'm wrong. This thing tracks you down in pretty much every area, starting from the very beginning. Truth be told, the pursuing spirit isn't terribly difficult to circumvent, but he adds yet another layer of stress to the game. As much as he constantly scared the hell out of me, I can't deny that he served his purpose wonderfully. This guy will either very quietly pursue you through the halls or suddenly teleport near you uninvited, which is marked with this sound effect. You, like me, may groan and say, "Oh, come on, dude," when you hear that sound while surrounded by enemies. But consider this, at least he makes a noise when he does that. A lot of the time, he's pretty sneaky. Sometimes his AI is a bit dumb, which is a welcome 7 seconds of comic relief across this brutal 10-hour-long game. If you manage to deal enough damage without succumbing to his insta-death curse accumulation status, you can put him down for a bit, but generally it's better to just run away. All in all, he's an effective device to keep you pooping your pants and moving forward. It seems like he's more likely to show up when you spend a lot of time in one room, so he's simultaneously an anti-coward mechanic while also being a cowardice multiplier. Without getting into too much spoiler territory, his existence also opens up some degree of player choice. This is because you can eventually deal with him, but doing so can alter your path through the game, each option with its own pros and cons. It's a good thing that Nuri Botake adds a constant intimidation factor to the game, because the bosses are pretty easy. Their AI is easily hooked on obstacles, and if you save your projectiles as I did, you can chew through them without too much trouble. If you go at them with melee, it's usually not much more than a DPS race. It's a shame that there aren't any unique mechanics centered around bosses to make them a bit more interesting or challenging on a first-time run-through. But their designs are cool, and it's satisfying to wail on something after being the wailee for so long. Not to mention the pre-rendered cutscenes that play during the introduction of a new boss or enemy are always really slick. You don't want the FMV to end, because the minute it does, you have to turn around and start running. As for the story, it's probably no surprise at this point, but it's very minimalistic in its execution. The premise is simple: you're a soldier avenging your fallen lord. The degree to which you engage with the game's story after this point is largely up to you, though I do recommend paying attention to notes and dialogue. There are characters you'll meet along the way in a sort of surreal, dreamlike manner similar to Silent Hill. The ways in which people speak isn't quite right, little pieces of information you come across appear to be off in some way, etc. It may immediately appear to be a straightforward historical fiction revenge story, but there's quite a bit going on underneath the surface that'll change your perspective as you inch closer to the final showdown. The nature of this world, the people within it, and the authenticity of the very situation becomes distorted and uncertain. How is it that you can revive at a shrine when you die, consequence-free? Why do so many item descriptions evoke familiarity in the protagonist? If you're a soldier for this clan, why are you so terrible at fighting? These questions are largely answered implicitly rather than through dialogue or cutscenes, so if you're looking for more traditional horror storytelling, you won't find it here. This isn't like Silent Hill where you frequently encounter characters who have their own arcs to advance. There are others here clearly undergoing their own struggles, but they're mostly limited to vendors for you. If you're a fan of that distinctly From Software method of storytelling via scattered context clues which have to be reconstructed, then Labyrinth is going to be right up your alley. Part of the intrigue in this world's lore is how connected the plot is to the creature and character designs, or even the puzzle concepts. In a project like this, it'd be very easy to slip on the feudal Japanese setting as a costume and call it a day, but Labyrinth goes well beyond that. For example, the first puzzle has you hunting down 4 medallions corresponding with the 4 divas of Buddhism. These divas are associated with particular colors and cardinal directions, and this is reflected in-game via the puzzle, where you must correctly order those gems. In order to find one of these medallions, you have to enter the basement of the first stronghold area, the Tower of Repetition, as it's called, which is sort of a mystery of its own. In the basement, you'll find an excavated pathway leading deeper into the earth. At the end, you'll find a massive supporting pillar inscribed with characters and a decomposing body clutching the red medallion. On top of being an unsettling visual, burying people alive underneath a building's construction site was a very real practice in Japan as late as the 16th century. In one such legend, a woman named Oshizu was compelled to become a sacrifice and buried underneath the supporting pillar of Maruoka Castle. There's always some cultural relevance to the composition of the game's puzzles, which adds a sense of grim realism to the proceedings. The different tower sections are meant to represent different Buddhist hells, reinforced by the notes you find detailing the sorts of wacky shenanigans that go on in these hells. While the game's aesthetics are interesting and terrifying by their own merits, the fact that they're so deeply intertwined with period-appropriate Japanese beliefs is commendable. It's a profoundly darker side of Buddhist culture and mythology than we're used to, and it's used to great effect here. The setting is very well utilized, and I really can't imagine a better fit for this game. Is the story good? It's certainly good enough, and even thought-provoking if you're willing to engage with it on the game's terms. There are plenty of metaphysical mysteries with room for theories and discussions. That said, it's told in that piecemeal style. If you're caught up in the gameplay, it's easy to miss the esoteric plot and symbolism, and thus it's very easy to disregard those deeper elements. Part of that is just the relentless nature of the game. You're rarely given a chance to stop and reflect on the things that you're seeing. You have to keep pushing at all times, desperate for survival. So speaking for myself, it was hard to stay in a scholarly frame of mind, and I'm sure I missed a lot because of that. That said, the basic framework of revenge story is fuel enough for a game like this, and I think it works regardless of how you approach it. In terms of scope and how well it executes on concept, Labyrinth of the Demon King is probably one of the best indie-esque games I've ever played. I say esque because yeah, it has a publisher, as many of the games we've talked about today do, but like those games, this was all done by a single person, J.R. Hudipole, as well as music supplied by Reimu Daifuku. It's a tremendous achievement in any case. What we have with Labyrinth is a much more outwardly survival horror experience. Your ability to defend yourself is limited, and from the beginning until the end, you're on the back foot. I won't lie, when the credits started rolling, I felt nothing but relief. This is a fantastic game, but it's one that I have no desire to revisit anytime soon. Hudipole states that games like Silent Hill, Condemned Criminal Origins, and indeed King's Field and Shadow Tower were all influences on Labyrinth. Artistically, the Silent Hill influence is clear, and combat-wise, the game shares a lot in common with Condemned. Despite those more obvious inspirations, Labyrinth really captures the spirit of those classic From games. The excitement and dread of exploration, the joy of finding new equipment or opening a shortcut, the difficulty and the subsequent relief when hitting a checkpoint, it all just scratches that particular itch. Against the odds, we even have a nice compromise between the lumbering, clunky gameplay of yesteryear and the fast-paced, fair challenge you might expect from a modern game. Did I die? Oh, I died. But I had nobody to blame but myself, most of the time. There's more here than meets the eye, and what meets the eye is already pretty damn impressive. It's not perfect, but it knows what it wants to be, and it bees it with confidence. Labyrinth of the Demon King carves out its own place in the modern horror classic pantheon. If you can tolerate its various layers of brutality, you'll find something very special here. Well, it's been over 30 years, but it finally happened. King's Field is mainstream. Well, sort of. People know what King's Field is now. It's bittersweet that it never got its due in its own day, but hey, better late than never. And in a sense, it was inevitable. Could we have possibly appreciated King's Field and Shadow Tower for what they were back in their own time? Some people could, yeah, but for most of us, it was just something that needed to stew for some time. The world we live in is complicated and fast-paced, and it's becoming more of both of those things all the time. It seeps into all aspects of our lives, our jobs, our relationships with others, our hobbies, which of course includes video games. Everything is complicated now. I mean, look at this. What am I supposed to do with all these buttons? It's all microtransactions, RPG elements, metas, ray tracing, and day one patches. Sometimes there's comfort in familiarity. Sometimes it's enough to do a few simple things as best you can. Sometimes it's more about the way you feel while playing a game than the mechanical sum of that game's parts. The games I've talked about today are different in many ways, and not every one of them will appeal to every person. Yet, they all share some things in common. expansive dungeons to conquer, deadly combat encounters, and most importantly, that brooding atmosphere. Just like I mentioned during the opening of this video, that's where Kingsfield endures, and that's where it continues to be a font of inspiration. A simple, communicable, and accessible base through which the player can be transported to another place. From the Technicolor worlds of Lunacid, to the endless darkness of the Demon King's Labyrinth, to the hallways, I guess, of Eternal Ring, each of these games is doing and saying something different, offering their own unique take on that slow and meditative dungeon crawling experience. Would that I had all the time in the world, my friends. I could tell you about the co-op insanity of Fly Night, the psychedelic open-world goodness of Dread Delusion, the addicting gameplay loops in roguelite takes on the genre like Devilspire or Dungeons of Blood and Dream, and all of the games still being worked on like Pale Abyss, Dream Spring, Hark the Ghoul, and however many dozens of others I'm forgetting. For better or for worse, there's a lot of talented developers out there, so I guess we'll just have to save some for next time. With that said, if any of the games I've talked about today are exciting to you, it'd be great if you could pick up a copy or wishlist them. Unless Eternal Ring, Kingsfield Mobile, or Hungry Ghosts are exciting to you, I mean, you still could pick up a copy of those, but that's less good for the industry and better for some reseller on eBay named Mike. Mike deserves to be happy too, but he shouldn't be. It's tough out there for small developers working on niche games. Supporting the things you find cool is the best way of manifesting more cool things in the future. Anyway, thanks for watching this Kings-like mega review, and always remember to stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.